Listen closely and imagine a map spread across a wooden table, its edges curled and browned with age, the inked letters looping in a calligrapher's hand. Upon that map, a huge swath of the world bears a single name, Tartary. The word feels like a geographer's shorthand and a storyteller's prompt at once, a place where the steppes meet myth, where travelers' tales and merchants' ledgers overlap with the imagination of distant capitals and shadowy peoples. Somewhere on that faded map, myth and history blur together. Subscribe and share in the comments what you'd chase first, the truth behind the legend or the adventure of not knowing. Tartary, historically, was less a single nation than a European catch-all for vast territories to the east and north of the familiar continent. To early cartographers, Asia was a quilt of kingdoms and unknowns, and Tartary became the label for the seams and selvage, lands that lay beyond the mapped borders of Christendom and the Islamic world. The term traveled on maps and through books, sometimes shading lands that we now name Siberia, sometimes overlapping with the Mongol Empire, and sometimes stretching into the myths of Cathay and beyond. The origin of the name itself is a brushstroke of medieval and early modern imagination. Europeans used Tartar to describe various Central Asian peoples, a name that carried echoes of Tatar, a Turkic-speaking group, and the fearsome memories of Mongol armies that swept across Eurasia in the 13th century. Over time, as merchants, missionaries, and diplomats threaded their way across caravans and mountain passes, their letters and journals painted pictures that were part fact, part rumor, and all the more powerful for the blur between them. In those dusty pages, travelers spoke of khans and steppe riders, of cities whose domes caught the sun like coins, and of peoples whose languages sounded like song to their ears. Persianate courts in Samarkand and Bokhara commissioned tiles that made palaces sparkle, while nomads crossed the grass seas with herds and colored tents that announced seasons and fortunes. These details entered European popular imagination, where ornate histories and sensational reports often outpaced cautious scholarship, and the silhouette of Tartary grew grander and stranger with each retelling. Maps from the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods preserved this blend of observation and myth. Cartographers working in Venice, Amsterdam, or London had access to reports from Jesuit missionaries, Ottoman envoys, and Russian fur traders, but the scale and scope of the Asian interior were so vast that blank spaces became invitations. To fill those invitations, mapmakers sometimes copied previous works, sometimes embellished features with speculation, and sometimes invented cities and rivers to balance the page. That cartographic habit helps explain how a single label could come to cover such diverse realities. One glance at an old atlas and you will see Tartary written in elegant script across tundra, desert, and mountain ranges. The label is less a precise boundary than a historical artifact of perspective, a relic of a time when Europe's knowledge of the East was still a mixture of curiosity and conjecture. Yet behind the labels were real people and complex polities. The Eurasian steppe was home to a succession of powerful entities, from the early medieval Khazar Khaganate to the great Mongol Empire that reshaped Eurasian connections in the 13th century. Later, Khanates such as Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Central Asian principalities of the Timurid and later Uzbek dynasties carried forward traditions of governance, scholarship, and artistic patronage that rivaled anything in Europe. When we speak of steppe empires, we must picture the rhythms of nomadic life that structured their politics, seasonal migrations that determined wealth, the importance of horses for war and social prestige, and the flexible, often federated political systems that could unite hundreds of clans under a charismatic leader. These were societies whose power lay as much in mobility and martial skill as in urban centers and monumental architecture. When they did build cities, those centers often became hubs for art, science, and trade that transmitted goods and ideas across continents. Cities like Samarkand and Bokhara were not mere outcrops of culture but veritable laboratories of exchange. The silk, the paper, the mathematics and astronomy that moved along the Silk Road converged there, producing astonishing mosaics, madrasas, and public spaces. European travelers, arriving later, sometimes mistook the cosmopolitan character of these cities for exotic exceptionality rather than signs of long-standing, indigenous sophistication. The Russian expansion into Siberia and the Far East added another layer to the story. From the 15th century onward, Muscovite and later Imperial Russian explorers, traders, and Cossack groups pushed eastward across rivers and taiga in a gradual process of conquest and incorporation. Their reports and maps gradually peeled back some of the mystery that Europeans attached to the region, but they also left administrative labels that, when filtered back into Western publications, were sometimes simplified into the older term of Tartary. In the offices of imperial mapmakers and in the manuscripts of gentry fascinated with natural history, Tartary began to decline as a scholarly term, replaced by more precise ethnic, tribal, and administrative names. Yet the older label remained in popular culture and in the minds of readers who preferred grand narratives to the tedium of cataloging. For them, Tartary continued to be an evocative shorthand for a lost, sprawling civilization just beyond the horizon of familiar history. That cultural afterlife of the name set the stage for the later myths that would swirl around it. When urban populations in Europe and North America encountered unfamiliar architectural styles in the 19th and early 20th centuries, some people read them as remnants of an earlier, unknown empire. Huge domed buildings, ornate facades, and wide avenues could be read in various ways, as trophies of industrial confidence, as expressions of colonial empire, or as footprints of a mysterious global civilization that had been erased. In the modern era, certain photographs and postcards of 19th-century buildings, grand train stations, exhibition halls, and civic palaces began to be interpreted by some as evidence of an architectural tradition attributed to Tartaria. When these images were removed from their contexts, disconnected from the histories of builders, architects, and urban reforms, they could be reassembled into a narrative of a lost global empire. The emotional power of these images rests partly on their beauty and partly on their anachronism when viewed without explanation. One persistent theme in contemporary Tartaria lore is the idea of a global catastrophe, often called the Mud Flood, that allegedly erased this civilization from the archaeological record and buried entire cities under meters of sediment. The theory posits that buildings whose lower stories appear subterranean are evidence of a sudden inundation or deliberate cover-up. This reading turns basements, sunken ground floors, and urban renovation into proof of catastrophe, but it overlooks the mundane, well-documented processes of urban change. Cities are living things that change in their ground levels for a host of ordinary reasons. Streets are raised and lowered as drainage improves, cellars are excavated and repurposed, and new layers of pavement and landfill accumulate over staggered generations of construction. Fires and wars force rapid rebuilding, and land reclamation projects shift shorelines and street profiles. When we peel back the myth of a single universal flood, a clearer and more prosaic tectonics of urban life emerges. Another common claim about Tartaria is that its architecture shows knowledge and technology that should not have existed at the purported time, suggestions of free energy, advanced machinery, or forgotten engineering feats. These ideas often rely on taking a striking photograph and assigning it a conspiratorial explanation without the supporting documents that historians use to trace the provenance of buildings, their funding, and the engineers who designed them. When you dig into municipal records, trade catalogs, and newspapers of the time, you usually find the names of architects, firms, and patrons whose careers can be followed through archival sources. Part of the reason these myths feel plausible to some is the way the 19th and early 20th centuries actually did produce an astonishing variety of public buildings. Industrial technologies like structural steel, cast iron, and plate glass combined with new wealth from colonial trade and industrialization, allowed architects to build on an unprecedented scale. Great railway stations, exposition halls, and municipal palaces dazzled contemporary eyes and were deliberately designed to impress, to suggest the triumph of a globalizing age. When those same buildings survive into the present day, weathered and sometimes altered, they can appear as relics of a vanished golden age. Add to that the selective amnesia that accompanies modernization, where governments and developers demolish what is inconvenient and preserve what is picturesque, and you have fertile ground for narratives about systematic erasure. But the act of demolition and redevelopment is itself well documented through permits, photographs, and economic histories, which point toward ordinary motives like profit, hygiene, and aesthetic fashions rather than secret plots. The psychology behind the Tartaria myth deserves attention because myths do important work in people's lives. They compress complex histories into dramatic narratives that are easy to share and emotionally satisfying. A story of a lost, technologically advanced civilization appeals to our love of mystery and our distrust of official accounts, and it offers a neat adversary in the form of an unnamed cabal or ruling elite who have suppressed the truth. These stories also provide a narrative of victimhood and recovery that can be empowering for some audiences. If the past has been stolen, then rediscovering it becomes an act of reclamation. That impulse can be benign and creative when it leads to historical inquiry and public curiosity, but it can be dangerous when it prompts the rejection of credible evidence or the spread of disinformation that undermines scholarly methods. To understand how such modern myths spread, we must trace the routes of communication that propel them. In the pre-digital age, fringe theories circulated through pamphlets, periodicals, and niche communities. Today, the infrastructure of the internet, search engines, social platforms, video streaming accelerates the process, allowing striking images and succinct claims to reach millions with minimal friction. Algorithms that favor engagement amplify content that elicits strong emotions, and so the most sensational narratives tend to travel fastest. Visual culture plays an outsized role. Photographs from the 19th century, when stripped of captions, become Rorschach tests for interpretation. If a caption explains that a building was an exhibition hall built for a World's Fair and designed by a known architect, the image becomes part of architectural history. Delete that context, and the very same photograph can be presented as evidence of a forgotten empire. The temptation to rearrange images to fit a theory is amplified by the affordances of modern editing tools and the human desire for pattern. Academic historians and archaeologists respond to these claims with patient, methodical refutations rooted in primary sources. They point to construction permits, engineering blueprints, financial records, correspondence between patrons and architects, and newspaper coverage that documents the public life of buildings. Archaeological layers are dated using stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, and material culture sequences that establish continuity rather than abrupt erasure. These methods do not produce the dramatic certainties conspiracy narratives promise, but they offer a more reliable map of the past. Sometimes the dispute centers on genuine complexity rather than outright fraud. Colonial histories, for example, are full of erasures and power imbalances, and the voices of subaltern peoples are often missing from official archives. If a narrative of Tartaria speaks to an injustice about the appropriation of land or the silencing of indigenous histories, it taps into real grievances. The corrective is not to invent entire civilizations, however, but to use historical methods to recover marginalized experiences through oral histories, linguistic evidence, and careful excavation. Language itself points us toward the more complex realities behind names like Tartary. The steppe was home to Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, Uralic, and various Siberian language families, each with its own dialectal geography and history. When Europeans applied blanket terms, they often erased those distinctions, making a Protean human landscape seem static and monolithic. Modern scholarship has worked to restore those subtleties by tracing linguistic continuities, recording oral literature, and analyzing place names that preserve centuries of movement and settlement. Cultural exchange across the steppe was intense and multidirectional. Religions, technologies, and art forms traveled with traders, clerics, and captives as men and women shifted allegiances between steppe and city. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and shamanic practices all left their marks in different regions at different times, producing hybrid art and architecture that resist tidy categorization. So what looks mysterious from a Eurocentric vantage point often reflects millennia of human mobility and creativity. Trade networks never really stopped operating, even in turbulent centuries. Goods such as silk, spices, metalwork, and paper crossed hundreds of leagues, while ideas flowed along the same routes. Merchants and caravans connected Mediterranean markets with Chinese artisans, linking textile designers, coiners, and potters in an exchange that created a shared material vocabulary across Eurasia. That shared vocabulary explains why certain motifs in architecture and crafts appear in multiple places without requiring a single monolithic empire to explain them. If you want to see living traces of these intertwined histories, look at the mosques of Bokhara, the caravanserais that dotted trade routes, and the timber-built dwellings of Siberia. Look also to the archival holdings in unexpected places, the Jesuit letters in Rome, the Ottoman imperial decrees in Istanbul, and the Russian administrative reports in St. Petersburg. Each of these bodies of text contributes fragments that, when assembled carefully, form a picture of continuous human presence and evolving institutions rather than an interrupted prehistory. The artistic sensibilities that conspiracy theorists sometimes attribute to Tartaria were also the products of multinational exchange. Architectural styles like the neoclassical, Beaux-Arts, and various revival modes drew inspiration from a mixture of local tradition and international taste. Architects trained in European academies brought back principles that were adapted to local climates, materials, and political contexts, creating hybrids that pleased local elites and declared modernity in public squares. For instance, the massive domes and colonnades that excite some mythmakers were often adopted by municipal governments and exhibition organizers who wanted to showcase civic pride and technological prowess. These features signaled membership in a network of modern states and cities, not the survival of an anonymous global civilization. The financing for such projects often came from industrial magnates, insurance companies, and municipal bonds, all documented in financial ledgers and press accounts. The story of urban development helps untangle many so-called mysteries. Take the phenomenon of buried lower facades. Sometimes streets were literally raised during periods of sanitary improvement to allow for better drainage and sewage, while during other periods, new sidewalks and cobblestones were piled atop older surfaces. Steam engines and canals shifted economic centers and forced some buildings to be retrofitted rather than demolished. Over time, these incremental changes accumulate the appearance of a sudden event, even though they were gradual and recorded in municipal archives. If you trace the threads of the Tartaria myth to specific internet communities, you find a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and performative certainty. Some participants are hobby historians who delight in the chase of historical mysteries, while others sell narratives because they attract an audience. The internet rewards clarity and surprise, and the story of a global empire erased by malice or catastrophe is both clear and surprising, making it a viral commodity. The appeal is also aesthetic. The buildings associated with Tartaria lore often possess a grandeur that suits the cinematic textures of social media. They make compelling thumbnails, and thumbnails become narratives. When an image of a grand neoclassical facade is paired with a claim of global conspiracy, the brain's pattern recognition shortcuts prefer the simple story over the investigative patience necessary to confirm provenance. It is crucial to emphasize that debunking Tartaria myths does not require dismissing the human longing they capture. People use myths to imagine alternative worlds, to grieve losses that official histories fail to acknowledge, and to connect with a past that feels more meaningful than a dry chronology. Historians who understand this human need can adopt a more empathetic tone and invite public curiosity into archives, restoration projects, and local histories that enrich public understanding without inventing a phantom empire. Public history projects, museum exhibits, and accessible scholarship have made great strides in reclaiming these stories for wider audiences. Digital archives, online map collections, and the digitization of newspapers allow listeners to follow the breadcrumbs from an evocative image back to its original publication. Community-driven projects that gather oral histories from descendants of steppe peoples or that preserve the craft traditions of Central Asia turn myth into research and preserve real cultural heritage. The discipline of archaeology itself offers methods that are antithetical to sudden erasure narratives. Archaeologists look for layers of habitation, trace material culture changes over time, and sometimes find evidence of catastrophic events like floods, fires, or earthquakes. Those findings are published in peer-reviewed journals, debated at conferences, and subjected to replication. When a dramatic event is proposed, archaeologists look for multiple lines of evidence, soil strata, carbon dates, pollen analysis, not a single evocative photograph. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provides one such line of evidence that often refutes catastrophic reset scenarios. Trees preserve a continuous environmental record and can show growth patterns interrupted by droughts, fires, or other stresses, none of which typically indicate a global or multi-continental catastrophe in recent centuries. Paleoclimatic studies, ice core samples, and sediment analyses similarly map environmental changes over time and place, showing continuity and fluctuation rather than sudden global resets. When conspiracy theorists point to anomalies in historical records, historians respond by contextualizing anomalies as part of the messiness of the archive. Records are incomplete, languages evolve, and names are transcribed inconsistently. That is not the same as evidence of deliberate deletion on a global scale. Rather, it reflects the transactional and fragmented nature of pre-modern record-keeping and the selective survival of documents. There is also a geopolitical dimension to the persistence of Tartaria myths. Distrust of institutions, whether governmental, academic, or corporate, has been growing in many parts of the world. When large populations feel economically disenfranchised or culturally marginalized, they may be more receptive to narratives that cast official histories as lies. Conspiracy theories can thus serve as vehicles for political discontent, offering a simple villain and a promise of reveal. In this political context, it is worth noting how the language of empire gets repurposed. Tartaria as a term can become a symbol for the ways in which colonial and imperial powers reshaped landscapes and histories, sometimes violently. That symbolic power needs to be addressed honestly. By acknowledging the real damage caused by empire, scholars and cultural workers can more effectively challenge fabricated myths by offering robust, humane historical accounts that include voices of the colonized. There are instructive case studies that illuminate how mythmakers misread historical evidence. Consider a 19th century exhibition hall built for a world fair. Photographs show stately columns, ornate ironwork, and a wide entrance with steps leading down to what appears like a sunken floor. A careful archival search reveals municipal planning documents, an architect's sketches, invoices for cast iron balustrades, and a newspaper account praising the hall's wonder. Seen in context, the building becomes a testament to industrial-era spectacle rather than to hidden histories. Another common misinterpretation concerns engineering feats like long-distance railways and bridges. Some have argued that such infrastructure implies centralized, near-universal coordination on a scale that could belong only to a single lost empire. But the historical record demonstrates that networks like railways were built through a patchwork of private companies, state concessions, foreign investment, and local labor. These projects were collaborative in a very modern sense, not the relics of a vanished world government. Language scholars have also contributed to the conversation by tracing the etymology of place names and the diffusion of technical terms. They show how words migrate and transform across languages, often carrying with them the evidence of contact without implying monolithic political structures. For example, architectural vocabulary can spread through pattern books and trade catalogs, explaining similarities across regions without invoking a single originating civilization. Popular myths sometimes claim that vital records, books, and archives were systematically destroyed to erase Tartaria. While records have been lost to wars, fires, and neglect, historians point to abundant surviving sources that map the administrative and cultural life of steppe regions across centuries. Church registers, tax rolls, travelogues, and consular dispatches are scattered across multiple imperial archives and, together with oral histories, offer a rich tapestry of continuity. One fascinating aspect of this entire conversation is how it reveals different literacies, the literacy of the archive and the literacy of the image. A photograph without a caption is a riddle, a line in a financial ledger without context is a cipher. The historian's work is to translate those artifacts into stories that are empirically grounded and meaningfully complex. This is less glamorous than the single sweeping revelation of a conspiracy, but it is more reliable, and it invites listeners into a longer, more rewarding engagement with the past. Tartaria myths also intersect with artistic utopianism and alternative histories in creative ways. Writers and artists have long imagined lost continents and antediluvian civilizations as canvases for critique, fantasy, and social commentary. When treated as fiction, the idea of a lost grand civilization can be a powerful allegory for the fragility of political orders and the resilience of human imagination. The danger arises when artistic speculation is presented as historical fact. At the personal level, many who embrace Tartaria narratives are motivated by sincere curiosity and a desire to find beauty in forgotten places. That aesthetic longing can be redirected toward conservation and preservation efforts that safeguard architectural heritage from demolition. Local history societies, heritage trusts, and renovation projects benefit from heightened public interest, and when curiosity is harnessed constructively, it does real good. Museums and cultural institutions can help by making their collections more accessible and by contextualizing artifacts with clear narratives that explain provenance, design, and social history. Exhibits that pair a photograph with the architect's name, the builder's ledger, and the worker's oral histories demystify the image and enrich the story. Such practices cultivate a public that values documented inquiry alongside wonder. We should also consider the role of education in shaping how people encounter the past. Curricula that emphasize critical thinking, source literacy, and the diversity of historical perspectives equip listeners to ask the right questions when faced with sensational claims. Teaching how to read a map, how to interrogate a photograph, and how to follow archival breadcrumbs empowers citizens to separate intrigue from error. International collaboration among historians, linguists, and archaeologists also produces more nuanced narratives than any single perspective can offer. The histories of Eurasia are multiple and overlapping, and no one nation has a monopoly on truth. When scholars from different countries pool archives and compare notes, the result is often a richer picture that makes room for local particularities within continental patterns. Looking forward, the debate over Tartaria offers an instructive case about how history is made, circulated, and contested in the digital age. The tools of scholarship, databases, digitized archives, and open-access journals are more powerful than ever, but they coexist with platforms that amplify rumor and oversimplification. The challenge is to use new technologies to democratize access to reliable sources while also fostering the interpretive skills necessary to understand them. In the end, the story of Tartaria is not one singular tale but a braided history made of real steppe empires, cartographic conventions, colonial expansions, urban transformations, internet-age rumors, and the aesthetic longing for a rediscovered past. Each strand matters. Each strand helps explain why a name like Tartary could persist as both an historical placeholder and a modern myth. So when you next come across a striking photograph of an old facade or a sunken street, take a moment to consider the quieter, more complicated explanations before leaping to catastrophe. Ask who built the building, who funded it, and what the city was like at that moment in time. Those mundane questions often lead to archives, people, and stories that are far more interesting than a conspiracy. If you are curious and want to follow the trail, start with accessible resources, digitized newspapers, municipal records, architectural archives, and reputable local historians. Trace a photograph to its original publication, look up the architect, and read the contemporary reviews. You will usually find that the past speaks for itself, given a patient ear and a willingness to follow the paper trail. Above all, remember that history is a collective endeavor that thrives on openness and skepticism in equal measure. Skepticism without evidence becomes cynicism, but openness without rigor becomes gullibility. The most rewarding path blends wonder with discipline, letting the beauty of the past draw you in while the methods of scholarship lead you toward trustworthy conclusions. There remains, however, an important political and moral lesson in the appeal of Tartaria myths. The past matters not just as a set of facts but as a terrain of belonging and identity. When people feel uprooted or left behind, they may turn to grand narratives that validate their sense of loss. Responding to that impulse requires historians and cultural workers to make history resonant and inclusive, to recover the stories of those too often left out of official accounts. Finally, consider the power of imagination when combined with evidence. Fiction can inspire real inquiry, and speculative narratives can become gateways to archival exploration and public history projects. The best response to fanciful claims is not scorn but invitation. Invite the curious to the archives, to the museums, to the conservation workshops, and to the conversations that reconstruct the past step by careful step. In that patient work, the multiple pasts of the steppe, the city, and the human imagination find their proper place, rich in detail and alive with continuity. When you lift an old map from a dim archive and let the paper unfold, there is a moment that feels like stepping into a house of memory. Inked coastlines lean like hands on a table, cartouches flourish with Baroque pride, and names you half recognize become invitations to a different geography. Among those names, printed in block or looping script, one word returns again and again in older European maps: Tartary. It rests there like a placeholder for distance, a shorthand for regions beyond immediate knowledge, and it opens a doorway into how people once made sense of the world. The word Tartary itself is a traveling shadow. When Europeans used it from the Middle Ages through the 19th century, they often meant large swaths of Central and Northern Asia without precise boundaries. It was not a single empire in the way modern readers might imagine, but a loose label applied by outsiders who mapped by rumor, traveler tales, and the reports of merchants and envoys. That lack of clarity on old maps became, for some modern readers, a fertile soil for imagination and then for reinterpretation. Maps do more than show terrain, they tell stories about who is doing the mapping. A 17th century atlas frames its unknowns differently from an 18th century nautical chart, and both speak to the priorities of their makers. A maritime nation emphasizes harbors and coasts, an imperial court marks borders, trade routes, and the places it desires to know and control. In that space where knowledge thins out, scribes sometimes wrote single words like Tartaria to say, "I do not know enough to be more precise," and that simple admission has been read, later, as a sign of a missing history. From that hinge point, a modern narrative thread grows. The internet has been a kind of blueprints market for the imagination, shoaling photographs and scans into collective stories. A grainy picture of a half-buried doorway, a 19th century engraving of a grand facade with windows below sidewalk level, or an old map with an unfamiliar name becomes raw material for a new tale. The pattern that emerges is one where the forgotten label Tartaria is reimagined as the name of a lost empire, a civilization that allegedly stretched across continents and was later erased from the conventional timeline. To understand how such a narrative spreads, listen first to the images that prop it up. Photographs circulating online often show ornate buildings with what appear to be buried stories beneath them. Low cellar windows, steps descending beneath a threshold, and facades with decorative arches sometimes read in these communities as evidence of a cataclysmic mudflood that buried lower floors and altered street levels forever. The scene is compelling. If you imagine a city suddenly half swallowed by sediment, the idea of a buried civilization makes dramatic sense and fills an emotional hunger for the secret and the lost. But the visual argument requires examination because architecture and urban life leave many traces that can be misread. Those cellar windows are often simply basements designed to admit light, or coal chutes that once led down to storage. In many older cities, the street and sidewalk levels have been raised or lowered intentionally for sanitation, flood control, expansion, and modern infrastructure. When builders dug cellars for heating stoves or workrooms, or when whole districts were elevated to allow proper drainage and sewer systems, the consequence was an apparent mismatch between building entrances and the contemporary street level. Take, for instance, the large engineering projects of the 19th century that remade cities across the industrializing world. Engineers and municipal officials altered streetscapes to install sewers and to regrade hills, to expand ports and to reclaim marshland for development. Those projects often required raising entire blocks by feet at a time, sometimes using hydraulic jacks to lift masonry and wooden structures so new foundations or utilities could be put in place. The result in many places is a cinematic layering of time, old doorways half hidden, windows that peer out under new pavement, staircases that lead to nowhere. Some of the famous episodes of urban transformation are illuminating because they match exactly what the mudflood interpretation offers, but they are documented, mundane, and explicable. Chicago in the mid-19th century and after the Great Fire undertook massive raising of streets to create sewers in a low-lying lake plain. Seattle experienced ambitious regrade projects that lowered or raised entire neighborhoods to make them more hospitable for commerce. In Boston, whole shoreline areas were filled and reshaped, turning marsh and waterfront into building lots. Those are not signs of a single cataclysmic event but of successive prosaic human choices and engineering responses to environmental and public health imperatives. Parallel to these technical explanations is the aesthetic angle. The 19th century, especially after the Napoleonic era, saw an explosion of architectural styles that drew on classical motifs, on Baroque exuberance, and on eclectic revivalism. Architects worked in stone, brick, cast iron, and later steel to create facades that looked monumental by design. When a viewer in the present sees identical ornament on multiple buildings across continents, it can feel like a signature of a single vanished culture. In reality, those similarities often reflect shared educational currents, textbooks, and pattern books that spread stylistic vocabulary across Europe and the Americas. Map reading itself can mislead fast and plausibly. An old map shows a landmass labeled Tartaria, and a modern reader who expects neat borders will try to fit it into modern geopolitical boxes. Cartographers used labels with loose meanings. They were translators of partial knowledge, not definitive reporters of nationhood. On top of that, projection and scale complicate perceptions. A Mercator projection inflates the high latitudes, for example, so the expanse of Siberia might look more dominant than it appears at a glance, and the eye can invent coherence where there was only a generalized indication of territory. Every map hides something between its lines. Subscribe and share in the comments if you're more fascinated by the secrets those maps left out or by the way they made distant lands look bigger than life. There is a human story to the way old maps were made, and it helps explain how names like Tartaria persisted. Travelers' accounts arrived in Europe bearing descriptions that combined observation, hearsay, and misunderstandings. A diplomat's report from a frontier post could be translated and retranslated, its place names adjusted to Latin or French conventions, and then reproduced by a cartographer who filled gaps with decorative cartouches or mythic creatures. Over time, the map becomes both a document and an aesthetic object, and that dual role invites imaginative retellings in later centuries. The mudflood idea, when viewed as a story told by images, gains more traction because it promises an explanation for vivid details that otherwise require more mundane and often dry technical knowledge. It condenses architecture, cartography, and urban history into an emotionally satisfying plot. There was a gulch, a collapse, a deliberate cover-up, and then the silencing of a civilization. Stories with villains, conspiracies, and dramatic moments travel quickly, and they find eager listeners who enjoy connecting apparently random pieces into a single grand picture. A striking thing about the Tartarian narrative is how it gathers other threads of belief into its weave. It borrows vocabulary and imagery from lost civilization tales that have been with us for centuries, from Atlantis to the palimpsest myths of prehistory. It resonates with a certain romantic sorrow. The modern world is so disposable that the idea of a magnificent prior age erased by catastrophe is both compelling and consoling. That longing for depth, to imagine that the present sits atop a glorious but concealed past, fuels attention and interpretation in ways that dry historical method rarely does. Online communities dedicated to the topic do careful, sometimes painstaking visual comparisons. They layer photographs from different eras, adjust contrast, and map decorative motifs from one facade to another. The techniques they use mirror legitimate historical inquiry in some respects. The difference is interpretive framing. Where a trained historian or architect might ask for documented renovation records, building permits, municipal plans, or newspaper accounts of engineering works, enthusiasts sometimes treat visual correlation alone as proof, valuing the pattern over corroborating context. Another powerful motor behind the narrative is the changing nature of archives themselves. As more cities digitize maps, photographs, and municipal records, the raw material for speculation becomes available to a larger and less specialized audience. What used to be buried in a local planning office or a university library emerges online and thus can be assembled into sequences by amateur sleuths. The democratization of access is valuable, but it also means fragments are more easily recontextualized without the scaffolding of professional historiography. The maps that first stirred modern curiosity about Tartaria are often visually impressive, full of compass roses, sea monsters, and decorated borders. They are not neutral objects. A large map serves rhetorical functions. It demonstrates power, curiosity, and the technical skill of the mapmaker and his patrons. A map printed with a grand cartouche calling out Tartaria invites the reader into a theatrical world of cartographic imagination. The theatricality can be mistaken for evidence of an actual empire when viewers project a modern understanding of nationhood onto a document made in a different time. Historians and geographers reading these maps place them within layers of human activity. They read marginal notes, examine the handwriting, study the place of publication, and compare multiple editions. Watermarks on the paper, the chemical composition of inks, and typographic style can date the piece more accurately than surface labels alone. Those details matter because they anchor maps to a chain of production and reception. They show the map as an artifact of knowledge rather than the last surviving record of a vanished culture. It is worthwhile to consider where the name Tartary converges with the real geopolitical history of Eurasia. The Mongol Empire and its successor states dominated large regions for centuries, and the label Tartar or Tartary in older European accounts often conflated many different peoples under a single exonym. Later Russian expansion eastward and the imperial interest of China in its borderlands created a palimpsest of states, peoples, and shifting control that European maps simplified. The simplification, over time, led to a kind of cartographic shorthand that contemporary readers might misread as evidence of an organized, centralized Tartarian polity. Even the etymology of the word is revealing. Europeans adapted the names they heard, Tatar, Tartars, to their own languages, which sometimes added mythic associations, including references to the hellish Tartarus of classical lore. Such linguistic overlays shaped perceptions and made the term carry more than a simple ethnographic label. The resulting ambiguity made Tartary convenient for mapmakers who needed to name large, little-known regions without pretending to precise knowledge. The narrative arc changes somewhat when the conversation turns to megastructures. Photographs of impressive 19th-century railway stations, exhibition palaces, and industrial halls are sometimes presented as ruins of technologies far beyond those known to historians of the era. The claim is that these landmarks are too advanced for their supposed date and therefore proof of a hidden technological zenith. Yet when you consider the context of the Industrial Revolution, the global exchange of ideas, and the competition of world expos, it becomes clearer that extraordinary architecture was often a deliberate display of modern prowess, not a relic of a missing civilization. Take, for example, the great exhibition buildings of the 19th century. They were, by design, demonstrations. The Crystal Palace in London, constructed in 1851, was revolutionary in its use of glass and iron and intentionally ephemeral in some ways, built to announce a modern age. World's fairs and expositions functioned as platforms where governments, industrialists, and designers showed off the latest materials and engineering. Their presence across continents illustrated how innovations traveled quickly through trade networks and industrial apprenticeships, producing impressive structures without resorting to the idea of an intervening lost empire. The same rapid diffusion explains why similar ornamentation appears in different regions. Pattern books circulated widely among architects. Apprentices trained in Paris, London, or Vienna carried ideas back to their home cities, and industrialized production allowed cast iron elements, terracotta, and prefabricated masonry to be moved long distances. In such circumstances, architectural motifs repeated like motifs in music, variations on a popular theme rather than evidence of an all-conquering culture secretly spanning continents. When people look at old photographs and see what appears to be deliberate burial or filling, they sometimes underestimate how ordinary urban processes can conceal layers of time. Construction debris, municipal filling for leveling, and the accumulation of detritus over centuries can raise a street as much as catastrophic flooding. Even when flood sediments are involved, those are usually local and explainable by river behavior, storm surges, and human interventions such as damming and levees rather than a perfectly timed global event. There is also a textual culture surrounding the Tartaria concept that moves beyond images. Readers encounter fragments of what they interpret as suppressed history, catalogs of lost technologies, mentions of Freemasonry, and references to seeming anachronisms in construction. These textual scraps are woven into conspiracy narratives that posit a deliberate erasure by powerful actors. The conspiracy frame is psychologically satisfying to some because it transforms complex historical processes, slow institutional change, economic shifts, and technological diffusion, into stories with villains and victims, making a chaotic past into a moral drama. To weigh such claims fairly, it helps to look at methods historians use to reconstruct the past. Archaeology of urban centers relies on stratigraphy, the study of layers of accumulation, which is often visible when a building is excavated. Layers of occupation, periods of fire, repair, and refurbishment leave material traces, nails, ceramics, bottles, coins, and building materials that can be dated or placed within known typologies. Historical documents, property records, tax rolls, municipal proceedings, newspapers often illuminate decisions behind urban renewal projects that visual inspection alone cannot reveal. Dating techniques matter, too. Material culture is classified by styles and manufacturing marks. Seriation helps place objects within a relative timeline. Absolute dating occasionally uses scientific methods like dendrochronology or radiocarbon analysis when organic materials are present. Those methods provide anchors that help distinguish between an intentionally buried layer from a cellar or a recent civic regrading. In most cases where alleged mudfloods are proposed, the evidence points to interpretable urban processes rather than an anomalous cataclysm. There are, nevertheless, legitimate examples of cities deeply altered by natural disasters, wars, and infrastructure transformations. London sits atop Roman and medieval layers, and in recent years major construction unearthed entire streets dating back centuries and allowed archaeologists to trace the city's evolution. In many places, war has leveled neighborhoods, leaving archaeological strata that show intense, rapid change. The human record is messy and occasionally dramatic. Acknowledging these dramas does not require inventing a singular lost civilization to explain what is, in truth, already intriguing. Part of the allure of Tartaria lies in what it promises, a simpler explanation for complexity, a single story that accounts for many curious details. People crave narrative continuity, and a hidden empire explains continuity between disparate architectural elements and map anomalies. Yet historical reality is often more fragmented. Cities are palimpsests, written and rewritten by demographic shifts, economic fortunes, planning philosophies, and the occasional great fire or flood. That messy reality resists neat summation. Even so, the imagery and rhetoric of Tartaria can have cultural resonance beyond the literal claims. For some, invoking a lost empire becomes a way to critique modern institutions, to lament the perceived decline of artistry, or to resist the narrative offered by conventional historiography. It can be a rhetorical device as much as an assertion of fact, a metaphor for things forgotten or disregarded by industrial modernity. When we hear such claims, it helps to listen for the emotional content behind them as much as the literal propositions. At the heart of many modern investigations into Tartaria is a practice that historians recognize, the comparative method. Enthusiasts compare facades, motifs, and maps, sometimes producing fascinating collations that reveal genuine patterns. Such work can be valuable when used cautiously. It can challenge accepted chronologies and surface overlooked connections. The problem arises when correlation is taken as causation and when carefully contextualized evidence is discarded in favor of the most dramatic interpretation. Another element to consider is the role of restoration and preservation in shaping modern perceptions. When buildings are repaired or reconstructed after periods of neglect, restorers sometimes reveal earlier design layers or reconstruct missing ornament. Those interventions may unintentionally create anachronistic appearances, blending original elements with later restorations in ways that can be misread as proof of older or different existence than documented. Conservation is an interpretive act, and the choices made by those who restore can affect how the past looks to future viewers. Contemporary digital tools have also transformed the way we interact with visual material. Image enhancement, interpolation, and framing can make a faint detail seem more intentional than it was. When a grainy photograph is sharpened, when lighting is adjusted to reveal a shadow, those operations can produce the illusion of deliberate concealment. The technology that democratizes archives can also allow images to be remixed in ways that obscure original context, unintentionally or not, and so deepen misunderstandings about what a picture is actually showing. There is a theatrical logic to images of ruins that should not be underestimated. Photography and engraving create powerful single moments that condense time. A single picture of a half-buried window carries within it a narrative that will be filled according to the viewer's frame of reference. If you start from a premise that an empire was hidden, the image does not challenge that because it is read in service of the hypothesis. If you start from municipal records and engineering plans, the same image serves as a detail to be explained within a broader, verifiable account. Examining the archives themselves, one finds ordinary human explanations for many apparent oddities. City council minutes record complaints about odor and disease that led to sewer projects, newspapers report on major public works, and engineering plans show the exact levels intended for new streets. These records do not make for sensational headlines, but they are the glue of urban history. Where enthusiasts see silence, historians sometimes find attention to detail, records that are simply less exciting when divorced from visual drama. A close reading of old maps also highlights the collaborative nature of mapmaking. A map often bears the fingerprints of multiple contributors: surveyors who measured coastlines, merchants who supplied place names, princes who requested territorial emphasis, and engravers who filled blank spaces with decorative figures. That compendium of inputs explains much of the variability in old representations. A space labeled Tartaria is less a declaration of a unified polity than a field in which multiple actors projected both ignorance and hope. It is also useful to reflect on the role of print culture in the spread of ideas about Tartaria. Newspapers and periodicals of the 19th century wrote about discoveries, inventions, and the expansion of empires. Those texts, when digitized and taken out of their original narrative arcs, can look like corroboration of modern claims. Pulling sentences from different articles without context produces a collage that appears to say more than the original publishers intended. Archivists and historians caution against reading such fragments as total evidence rather than as part of a larger conversation. When considering claims about lost technologies or supposed arcane knowledge in the architecture, remember the realities of 19th century craftsmanship. Engineers and builders were experimenting fiercely with materials like cast iron, wrought iron, and later steel and reinforced concrete. Many innovations come from practical necessity: longer spans for train sheds, lighter roofs for exhibition halls, and standardized parts to speed construction. Those are not signs of hidden wisdom but of a period of intense and public technical experimentation. It is worth pausing on the human drama in these debates. The people who believe strongly in Tartaria are not merely agents of gullibility, they often feel a deeper sense of disenchantment with official narratives. They may distrust institutions that sanitize history or focus on elite accounts, and they may want to find a narrative that centers grandeur in the margins. That psychological dimension is important because it reveals why certain stories stick and why they are told with such conviction even in the face of contradictory evidence. Scholars and critics of the narrative often approach the subject with a combination of patience and exasperation. For historians, the temptation to dismiss all claims out of hand is real, but so is the recognition that there are genuine curiosities worth investigating. A healthy historiographical approach parses claims carefully, documents them, and uses multiple lines of evidence to draw conclusions. That method can be slow and methodical, but it has the advantage of being accountable and replicable. At the same time, the modality of online storytelling values speed, certainty, and drama. A clean claim that a civilization was erased sells more easily than a meandering archival exposition about street-lifting machinery. This mismatch of rhetorical styles explains some of the conflict between communities. One values narrative clarity and revelation, the other values nuance and documentation. Both are trying, in their own ways, to make the past meaningful in the present. Archaeologists also show that human settlements have long and complicated life cycles, including cycles of construction, destruction, reuse, and abandonment that can easily be misread by non-specialists. A foundation built for an earlier floor can be repurposed by a successor generation, and later builders may incorporate or hide earlier work. That bricolage is a fundamental fact of urban life and explains many visual oddities without invoking a sudden global covering event. To understand the appeal of the Lost Empire idea more deeply, consider the role of narrative in identity formation. When people feel disconnected from official histories, they often construct histories that better reflect their values or aspirations. A narrative about a suppressed golden age gives meaning to a sense of exclusion and provides heroes and villains in a story that explains current misfortune. Recognizing that function does not require demeaning the people who hold these beliefs, it simply situates them within broader human patterns of storytelling. There is also an aesthetics of ruin that informs the whole conversation. The romantic interest in dilapidated grandeur goes back at least to the 18th century, when ruins of classical antiquity were central to artistic imaginations. Photographers and travel writers' portraits of weathered stone and ivy-clad facades tap into the sublime, decay as evidence of beauty and depth. That aesthetic predisposes some viewers to read traces of permanent grandeur in any aged building, and it primes them to imagine a previously global scale of magnificence. If we turn to particular visual claims within the Tartaria narrative, many rely on misdated photographs. Modern image repositories sometimes label photographs with approximate dates and attributions, and mistakes propagate. When a 19th century image is misdated or miscaptioned and then circulated with a claim that it proves an advanced technology at a certain earlier date, the error gains authority through repetition. It is a cautionary tale about the care required in using images as historical evidence. The process of verification is rarely glamorous, but it is often decisive. Cross-referencing an image with newspaper archives, municipal records, and contemporaneous accounts can confirm or refute a claim. In several documented cases where enthusiasts proposed a mudflood, researchers found clear municipal records describing street regrading, sewer installation, or drainage projects, sometimes with precise elevations and dates. Those records, mundane as they are, provide the missing explanation for the most dramatic visual cues. Another line of inquiry is the material analysis of alleged mud layers. True, sudden and widespread deposits of fine sediments are the signature of certain natural disasters, volcanic ash falls, lahar deposits, or massive floods. Geologists and sedimentologists can analyze samples for particle size, composition, stratification, and organic content to determine whether a layer represents gradual urban fill, heavy storm deposit, or something like volcanic ash. In the vast majority of claimed mudflood sites, the geological evidence points to gradual accumulation or human filling rather than a single cataclysmic layer. It is important to recognize that the 20th century added new complications to cityscapes that can be misread by future observers. Rapid modernization, motorization, and the introduction of utilities altered streets and facades dramatically. The insertion of concrete curbs, the filling of light wells to create more usable ground-level space, and the application of stucco or tile over older masonry all changed the appearance of buildings in ways that might later be interpreted as signs of concealment. Those alterations are ordinary responses to changing needs and tastes rather than evidence of conspiratorial erasure. Sometimes the small details are revealing in the most convincing way. A building permit from 1873, a ledger describing the purchase of bricks, a photograph documenting a bridge's construction. These small artifacts cumulatively build a picture that is often more compelling than a speculative macro-narrative. Historians prize these fragments because they ground stories in accountable evidence. The cumulative weight of such records is what makes the conventional accounts of urban development so persuasive to those who study them closely. There is also a legal and economic dimension to the subject that seldom receives adequate attention in speculative accounts. Property rights, municipal ordinances, tax assessments, and insurance claims all leave trails showing how buildings were altered and why. Economic incentives motivated many changes. Raising a street to avoid flooding protects property values, improving drainage attracts commerce, rebuilding after a fire allows for denser construction. Understanding these incentives helps explain why certain changes happened when they did. Occasionally, genuine mysteries and anomalies appear in the historical record, and these are precious because they challenge scholars to refine their methods. A building with an inexplicable lower story, a map with a strange symbol, or a photograph lacking provenance can provoke legitimate inquiry. Professional historians welcome such puzzles because they often lead to productive research. The difference between a fruitful question and a cosmological claim is the level of evidentiary rigor that accompanies the inquiry. Another factor shaping perceptions is the emotional power of narrative closure. A theory that neatly explains disparate data points is psychologically tempting, and humans have a bias toward coherence. That bias makes the mind a story-making device, seeking the single thread that connects everything. Disciplined historical method resists that impulse, tolerating ambiguity and accepting incremental understanding over grand syntheses without sufficient evidence. Yet even as we critique the more extravagant claims, it is important to respect the imaginative energy that animates them. People who explore Tartaria are doing, in their own way, the same thing historians do, searching for meaning in the traces left by the past. That shared curiosity is a starting point for conversation rather than a reason for condemnation. Bridging the gap between rigorous scholarship and popular curiosity is one of the most promising avenues for public history in the digital age. It helps to look at other cultures' historical blanks to see how the mind fills them. When explorers encountered the Americas or sub-Saharan Africa, early European accounts often stamped those places with legendary features, sometimes exaggerating local architecture or social organization. These early misrepresentations were the result of limited observation, cultural bias, and a taste for the extraordinary, and they help explain the longer-term persistence of place names and impressions. Tartary, in that lineage, becomes a modern iteration of a recurring pattern, a label for the unknown that grows into something larger in the popular imagination. The role of museums and universities in mediating this conversation is significant. These institutions are repositories of expertise and context, and when they open their doors to public engagement, displaying maps with clear interpretive labels, offering archives with accessible guides, and hosting dialogues about how to read evidence, they reduce the space in which wild conjecture can flourish unchecked. Scholars are often eager to engage with enthusiastic communities, and such collaboration can be mutually informative when it occurs in good faith. There are also legal and ethical considerations when discussing destroyed or altered cultural heritage. Claims of erased civilizations sometimes intersect with legitimate debates about historical suppression, colonizers rewriting the stories of colonized peoples, for example, and institutions displacing artifacts. Those real histories of erasure are important and deserve attention. However, mixing them with unsubstantiated claims of universal cover-ups risks obscuring genuine injustices under a cloud of speculative myth. As the debate continues, the empirical record expands. Archaeological digs, urban excavations, and newly digitized records provide ever more data with which to test claims. Sometimes data confirms surprising continuities, sometimes it dispels myths. That process of discovery is not final or absolute, but it is cumulative and self-correcting in a way that pure speculation is not. Over time, the robust method tends to yield explanations that remain plausible under new evidence. For listeners who are drawn to the more romantic side of the story, there is satisfaction to be found in the actual history of 19th-century global exchange. The sheer scope and ambition of industrial-era projects, the speed of technological diffusion, and the aesthetics of civic pride together produced landscapes that were often astonishing. Those histories are not smaller or less important than a tale of a lost global empire. They are, rather, richer in human detail and often just as grand when properly understood. When you trace the arc of maps from medieval portolan charts to modern topographic sheets, the evolution reveals the growth of empirical methods. Mapmakers began with coastal knowledge and slowly added inland detail as survey techniques and instruments improved. Some regions lagged behind others because of geography, political obstruction, and cultural barriers to travel and recording. A blank or a broad label on an old map tends to indicate a lack of precise European knowledge rather than the actual absence of complex societies. The modern world is full of legible traces of the past even when they are unexpected. Light wells, coal chutes, and half-basement windows are signs not of unnatural burial but of daily life in earlier technological regimes. When you think of a city as a living organism, those features are the scars and adaptations that show how it survived winters, floods, and periods of scarcity. They are, in their own way, intimate evidence of human ingenuity rather than signs of a hidden global scheme. It should be said that the idea of constructive skepticism is a strong tool in historical work. Questioning official narratives is necessary and fruitful. Many discoveries come from anomalies spotted by amateurs and then pursued by professionals. The best outcomes occur when curiosity is paired with rigorous methods, asking for sources, comparing independent lines of evidence, consulting specialists in architecture, geology, and archival studies, and being willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. That methodological humility is the foundation of credible revision. Another important point is that the materials of the 19th century survive in abundance. Photographs, municipal documents, trade catalogs, and periodicals often provide the missing context that resolves ambiguities. With patience and cross-disciplinary collaboration, researchers have explained many of the visual anomalies that once seemed inexplicable. The availability of material does not mean all questions have answers, but it does reduce the likelihood that a global cover-up explains widespread architectural curiosities. Stories about Tartaria also prompt us to think about how modern communities create shared history. The internet enables rapid storytelling and collective sense-making, and communities that form around fringe theories are often earnest in their search for coherence. That communal impulse is not new. Human beings have always gathered around stories that unify experience. What is new is the scale and speed at which those gatherings happen, and the challenge is matching that energy with ways of critically testing claims in public spaces. Sometimes the question becomes not whether a lost empire existed, but what it would mean if it did. The idea of Tartaria speaks to contemporary anxieties about who writes history, whose heritage is recognized, and how definitively we can know the past. Engaging with those anxieties opens productive dialogues about representation, archival access, and the politics of heritage. The myth, for all its factual shortcomings, serves as a mirror reflecting unresolved cultural anxieties that merit attention. A practical path forward for those intrigued by Tartaria is investigative discipline paired with wonder. Visit local archives, speak to municipal historians, and compare sources carefully. Learn a little about building permits and street engineering jargon and how to read a plan. Approaching the subject not as a binary matter of proof but as an iterative inquiry that yields progressive understanding makes the investigation both more honest and more rewarding. It is also healthy to cultivate an aesthetic appreciation for the real materials of history. The grain of an old map, the weight of a cast iron column, the way light slants through a basement window at midday, those small moments of contact with the past are themselves powerful. They do not need to be explained away with a grand narrative of forgotten empires. Instead, they can be celebrated for the complex human stories they contain, the draftsman tracing a coastline, the mason carving a lintel, the families who lived and worked in devoting spaces now half hidden. When scholars publish findings that disagree with popular narratives, the tone of the conversation matters. Confrontation rarely convinces, and shaming often pushes people further into enclaves of belief. Productive engagement begins with listening, asking clarifying questions, and offering accessible evidence without condescension. Academia can learn from the grassroots by treating curiosity seriously. Grassroots communities can learn from academia by embracing the slow, collaborative work of verification. The story of the maps labeled Tartaria is, at the end, a story about the limits and strengths of human knowledge. Labels and lines on paper are attempts to constrain a messy world into comprehensible forms, and they succeed imperfectly. Where a label lacks precision, centuries later the mind can fill the space with myth. Yet the practices of archival research, archaeology, and material analysis provide steady corrective lenses that reveal how human lives produced the surfaces we see today. There is also a broader cultural lesson in the phenomenon. Modern connectivity means that historical claims spread faster than ever before, but it also means the tools to test those claims are more widely available. That duality creates both risk and opportunity. It is a risk because errors and conspiracies can gain traction. It is an opportunity because people who are curious and diligent can access sources that were previously gatekept and bring new interpretations to light. If you wander through a city keeping these ideas in mind, you will begin to see layers everywhere. A shopfront with a faded sign tells you about commercial life. A stoop lowered for carriage access tells you about the rhythms of travel in another age. A plaque that commemorates a civic improvement project tells you about the municipal priorities of a previous generation. Each of these signs is a breadcrumb that, when followed, reveals a chain of decisions rather than a sudden geological swallowing. That chain of decisions is often messy and contradictory. Businesses change hands, architectural tastes evolve, economic fortunes rise and fall, and then civic planners respond with infrastructure projects that further change the landscape. Over decades and centuries, the accumulation of small adaptations produces scenes that, at first glance, appear mysterious. Looking closely often reveals the sequences that produced them, and those sequences are typically ordinary rather than metaphysical. The narrative of Tartaria, with its maps, mudfloods, and megastructures, will likely continue to be attractive because it combines visual drama with the romance of a hidden past. It is a story well suited to the aesthetics of internet storytelling, with bold images, compelling before and after comparisons, and a satisfying villain. Yet to move from story to historical claim requires a discipline of evidence, one that embraces nuance and accepts that sometimes the most interesting things are the slow, incremental, and bureaucratic acts that reshape cities over time. Listening to the conversation around Tartaria, one hears a chorus of motivations: curiosity, mistrust, creativity, and sometimes a longing for a more magnificent history. The challenge, and the possibility, lies in channeling that energy toward collaborative inquiry. When enthusiasts and scholars work together, each can bring useful tools, the passion to notice patterns, and the expertise to test them. That partnership can turn a contentious debate into a productive exploration of how we reconstruct and understand our shared past. In the end, the maps are beautiful because they are both objects of art and tools of knowledge. The label Tartaria on an old atlas is less a secret code than a sign of the limits of earlier map-making and the urge to name what was distant. Mudflood imagery is often compelling because it condenses the visual into a single claim, but it rarely accounts for the complexity of urban life and engineering. The megastructures visible in photographs and engravings were usually public demonstrations of industrial-age pride rather than proof of a hidden technological apex. If you are driving or walking as you listen to this, pause and look at the buildings around you with a new curiosity that values detail and documentation. Wonder at the ornament, yes, but also consider the ordinary processes that led to that ornament, the funding decisions, the materials available, the workforce, the municipal plans. That kind of curiosity bridges the gap between romantic myth and productive historical inquiry. The enduring human desire to find grand patterns in the past will not fade, and there is a dignity to that search. But pairing that impulse with method and patience enriches the story. Tartaria, as it exists in modern discourse, is a mirror of our hunger for origin stories and our ambivalence about institutional narration. Reading the map and tracing the sediment, testing the dates, and following the paper trail turns conjecture into a conversation about who we are and how we remember. There is room in that conversation for multiple voices: the amateur sleuth who notices an odd detail, the archivist who retrieves a forgotten ledger, the geologist who samples a stratigraphic section, and the historian who links the fragments into a plausible narrative. Each brings a part of the truth into focus. Together they show that the past is not a single locked secret waiting to be revealed, but an ongoing process of interpretation and discovery. When you close an old map now, perhaps you will feel less like you have glimpsed a missing empire and more like you have touched an interface between knowledge and imagination. That touch is both delicate and profound. The story of Tartaria, with all its graphics and claims, invites us to examine how we see the past, to test the evidence patiently, and to savor the real marvels of human craft and urban life without needing to imagine a global cover-up to make them meaningful. So keep looking, keep asking for the receipts, and keep the wonder. Historical truth accumulates slowly and sometimes disappointingly, but it is also robust and often more interesting than a single tidy conspiracy. In the layers of maps and the steps descending to basements, in the painstaking records of city councils and the steam of 19th century engineering, there is a richness that rewards curiosity tempered by method. That combination of wonder and rigor is perhaps the best way to honor both the maps themselves and the human stories they carry. I want you to imagine arriving at a city that seems to have stepped out of a dreamscape, where stone rises into the sky in shapes both familiar and alien, and where every facade is a page from a book no one remembers reading. The light slips along carved cornices and stained glass like a slow, deliberate hand, revealing patterns that seem to repeat in an order older than the map in your pocket. People call this vision Tartaria, not as a place pinpointed on any modern atlas, but as an idea, a layer of architecture and memory that persists in photographs, ruins, and the tales that hitch themselves to old stones. Listen closely and the stones will begin to tell you about cathedrals, star forts, and world fairs, about the aspirations they embodied and the stories they carried into the dust of later centuries. Walk down a nave of one of these imagined cathedrals and feel the geometry of it around you, arches rising like measured breaths, vaults cradling the sky, and the central aisle drawing your sight toward an altar where light pools like a promise. The columns are not merely supports but statements, their capitals telling myths in a language of leaves, beasts, and angels. There is a sound to the place too, an echo that hangs between notes when a choir rises, a sound that makes the walls seem to breathe. For those who believe in the vanished age of Tartaria, these cathedrals are more than religious monuments, they are relics of an architectural grammar shared across continents, hints of a lost design language that once linked cities like the stitches of a hidden cloth. When you step outside the church and into the city, the silhouette changes but the feeling persists. Domes appear, sometimes severe and low, sometimes towering, and in their curvature you can read an ambition to capture the heavens in brick and mortar. Spires elongate and fracture the horizon, their points acting like fingers pointing to stories above and below. The exteriors are often covered in ornament that seems both local and cosmopolitan, a hybrid vocabulary that suggests movement of craftsmen, ideas, and money across great distances. It is this sense of widespread similarity that fans of the Tartarian thesis latch onto, interpreting common elements as evidence of a unified building practice or an empire of thought rather than coincidence or shared influences. To understand why these buildings provoke such imagination, you have to appreciate the way architecture encodes power. Cathedrals, by design, are statements of authority and belief, huge investments of labor and resources that transform a skyline into a kind of book meant to be read by both the pious and the powerful. A facade communicates ideology, a rose window teaches cosmology, a bell tower schedules communal time. When a whole cluster of cities exhibit recurring monumental forms, it invites a question: whose hand in the past drew these lines so consistently? The question, asked in certain circles, becomes a legend about Tartaria, a vanished age when a single architectural ethos shaped the built world. That legend stretches beyond churches into the geometry of defense, where star forts punctuate landscapes with their sharp, puckered geometry. Look down from a hill and you see a starburst pattern, bastions projecting outward like teeth designed to break up the advance of attackers and to dissolve the siege into angles. These fortifications are not accidental, they are the product of careful military science, a response to the age of cannon and organized assault. Yet when you examine them close up, their scale and elegance suggest aesthetic as well as utilitarian purposes, grassed ramparts that soften into parkland, moats that reflect sky like deliberate mirrors, a choreography of approach that is as much about spectacle as survival. The Star Fort is a lesson in controlled geometry, a place where mathematics meets earth. Its walls are angled to deflect cannonballs and to create overlapping fields of fire, and the bastions allow defenders to sweep the approaches. Still, the layout of a fortress is also a public theater, designed to impress friends and intimidate foes. In many cases, these works required massive mobilizations of labor and materials, and they became focal points of urban life, not merely fenced-in military compounds. The popularity of such designs across distant regions fuels the imagination of those who seek a unifying force, as if the same master builders traveled continents, leaving their signature in star-shaped footprints. Now shift your gaze to the glittering pavilions of world fairs, where the late 19th and early 20th centuries condensed optimism into glass and iron. The great exhibitions were experiments in scale, where iron skeletons and plate glass could be assembled into vast, temporary cathedrals of commerce and spectacle. Under the light of gas and later electric lamps, these exhibition halls magnified the achievements of industry, art, and colonial reach, offering visitors a compressed vision of progress. For believers in the Tartarian narrative, world fairs represent high points of a global, interconnected architecture. Moments when the language of monumental building was televised as a universal idiom. Walk through one of those fairgrounds in your imagination. You pass under triumphal arches, pause beside fountains topped by allegorical figures, and find yourself dwarfed by machinery displayed as moral exemplars. The pavilions are stage sets and classrooms at once, instructing a populace about possible futures. They reified the dream that humanity could build better worlds through science, trade, and design, and that dream left a visible trace in the skyline. When those structures vanished or were dismantled, their photographs and paintings remained, and these images were later rearranged into theories of lost civilizations by those who read familiar shapes as remnants of a single grand architecture. It is tempting to treat Tartaria purely as a conspiracy theory, a late product of internet sleuthing and pattern recognition gone exuberant. Yet there is another way to listen. Treat Tartaria as a myth-making process that arises when architecture obsesses the imagination. People have always sought continuity, connecting the ruins they find to a coherent past. The built environment resists silence. When facades are stripped, when maps redraw borders and empires evaporate from textbooks, the structures themselves remain, and the mind seeks a story to explain them. That storytelling can become elaborate, and architecture provides a durable backbone for it. Consider the way photographs alter our sense of history. A black and white image of a grand building, the edges softened by time, can be misread as evidence of an older technology if context is stripped away. We forget that the camera frames and flattens, that an image captures a single moment removed from a chain of dates, uses, and renovations. When a building once used for a civic purpose is later repurposed, its new function can look like evidence of disappearance to those who come later. Fans of Tartaria comb archives and postcards searching for anomalies, and when they discover buildings with macro-scale ornament or uncommonly large fenestration, they interpret them as tokens of a forgotten empire, as if architectural extravagance must have been the legacy of a centralized authority. There is a romance to the idea because it honors the grandeur that people see before them. Thinking of cathedrals and star forts as the remains of a vanished global civilization elevates them from local histories to the status of relics of a universal past. This is flattering for the architecture itself. These are buildings that demand narrative. They are built at such scales and with such attention to proportion that they invite myths. It is no surprise then that photographs of these places, whether in rural backwaters or urban centers, become data points in alternative histories. Architecture has always been political, and part of the story includes deliberate erasure and transformation. Urban renewal, industrial expansion, imperialism, and simple neglect have all altered the face of cities. Entire neighborhoods have been razed, and buildings have been refaced or hidden. Sometimes construction simply covers older structures with a newer skin, a common practice known as adaptive reuse, and the older bones remain but are invisible at a glance. A terrace house might hide a much older facade, a public hall might be rethemed with new ornament. When a layer is peeled away, people sometimes misread the damage as evidence of what some call a mud flood or deliberate global reconfiguration. Historians, however, point to more mundane causes: reforming tastes, economic necessity, and changing functions. Yet the mundane explanations do not always silence wonder. Stand in a ruined cathedral and listen to the way wind moves through its empty windows, and some tenderness creeps in. The human voice becomes small in such a cavern, and history feels tactile. Scholars might catalog masons' marks, technological advances in vaulting, and the provenance of stone, but the lay imagination prefers to linger on big questions. Who raised these walls? What did they believe? What music filled these spaces? The magical element of Tartaria fills those gaps with a grand narrative, a sweeping explanation that reassures and intrigues at once. To explore cathedrals properly, start with their anatomy. The nave guides the congregation, transepts shape the plan into a cross, the choir holds the liturgical drama, the apse curves into a stage for light. Each element has both functional necessity and symbolic heft. The height of a nave concentrates eyes upward, intent on the divine. Flying buttresses push the force of the roof out and down, a structural ballet that permitted glass and light to become central players in devotional architecture. Each of these innovations came from iterative improvements, from centuries of trial and error in workshops and masons' yards, but to a modern observer they may read as the signature of some grand systemic knowledge. Look more closely at the stonework and you will find clues to how these edifices were built. Masons' marks, those coded symbols chiseled into cut stones, reveal the workshop networks and the ways labor was organized. They are like fingerprints, telling us where the stones came from and sometimes linking buildings across regions. The weathering patterns in the stone, the way mortar has receded or consolidated, provide archaeologists with stratigraphic data about repairs and extensions. Fans of Tartaria look at these marks and see a map of a vanished administrative system, while conservators read them as the trace of guilds and itinerant masons whose craft knowledge migrated along trade routes. Scale plays an important role in the conversation. Many of the buildings that feed the Tartarian imagination are oversized for their apparent communities. A grand market hall or civic palace may seem disproportionate until you remember that cities once aspired to impress rather than to match their current population sizes. Monuments often outlived the societies that built them, becoming anchors around which smaller, humbler life continued. For centuries, the cost of maintaining such edifices could be borne by wealthy patrons or centralized powers, and when those systems shifted, the buildings remained as anachronistic testaments. This mismatch fuels the sense that something large and centralized must once have existed to command such resources. The shared motifs, grand domes, elaborate cornices, expansive colonnades, invite comparisons across far-flung regions. But architectural convergence does not necessarily prove a single origin. Throughout history, cultures borrowed, adapted, and reinvented successful design elements, and craftsmen traveled widely. The same principles of thrust and balance that produce a stable dome will recur wherever builders face similar challenges. Gothic arches, Byzantine domes, and Islamic muqarnas all appear in different contexts because they solve specific structural and climatic problems. Yet the persistence of these forms over time does say something important about human preferences for proportion, rhythm, and symbolic representation. Consider the role of technology in spreading architectural ideas. The invention of the printing press, the circulation of pattern books, and later photographic reproduction all accelerated how ideas moved. Where once a mason might learn techniques by apprenticeship in a single town, now designs could leap continents by being engraved, printed, or photographed. Pattern books circulated recipes for facades, columns, and decorative motifs, and they offered templates that local builders could reinterpret with regional materials. In this sense, the apparent global sameness of certain elements could be explained by the globalization of knowledge rather than by a vanished empire. The star forts we spoke of earlier reflect a similar story of shared knowledge. Engineers and military architects of the early modern period exchanged treatises, and the principles of fortification were disseminated through treatises and models. These designs show up in Europe, the Americas, and beyond not because of a single political authority but because the logic of defense against artillery converged on similar solutions. Nonetheless, when a modern observer looks at the maps of fortified towns, the radiating symmetry can be startling. It invites the eye to imagine an aesthetic continuity, as if the entire world had been drafted by the same hand. When world fairs come into the picture, the timeline stretches forward into modernity and showcases the optimistic veneer of the industrial age. The great expositions left photographic records that look like picture books of modernity, iron frameworks crowned with classical pediments, monumental staircases, halls full of machines and wonders. There were performance spaces where nations displayed a curated narrative of progress and civilization. The ephemeral nature of many of these pavilions, built to impress for months and then dismantled, leaves a gap. We have images and souvenir plates, but little in the way of permanence. That ephemeral aspect fuels speculation about what else might have been lost. Photographers of the 19th century documented streets, plazas, and buildings as urban life accelerated, and occasionally the images show grand facades partially buried or buildings with doors blocked and windows bricked. In the hands of mythmakers who favor the Tartarian narrative, these images become evidence of a cataclysmic event that buried entire stories beneath sediment. Historians, by contrast, point to a range of explanations: alterations for new uses, regulatory restrictions, or simply the layering of later construction around older foundations. There is rarely a single dramatic event that explains all anomalies, but the human mind prefers a tidy narrative, and the notion of a sudden, world-engulfing catastrophe is a tidy and satisfying one. To appreciate the true complexity of cities, consider how often functions change. A cathedral can become a warehouse, a palace might be subdivided into homes, and Beaux-Arts train stations can be adapted into markets. Adaptive reuse preserves structures but transforms social meaning. When civic rituals fade, the monuments remain as scaffolds for new narratives. For some, the survival of a structure is proof of continuity; for others, its alteration is evidence of loss. That tension is essential to the ongoing fascination with a supposed Tartarian past. Listen to the city at night and you hear another layer of history. Gas lamps become electric, and the play of light across carved stone changes everything. Facades that took on a warm, human scale under candlelight can seem harsh and monumental under floodlit electric arcs. The technology of illumination thus shapes perception. World fairs exploited this, staging nighttime spectacles that made architecture shimmer and glitter, turning buildings into mirrors of the future. Those images, widely circulated, seeded dreams of alternative realities that were just as vivid as the physical structures themselves. Symbolism is woven through these buildings like thread. Facades communicate morality, allegory, and civic identity. Statues hold books or torches, pediments frame scenes of harvest and industry, mosaics map cosmologies. To the building's creators, these were deliberate choices meant to educate as much as to decorate. To later observers, the same symbols are puzzle pieces in a game of reconstructive history. The presence of certain motifs, suns, stars, compass roses, leads some to link them to secret societies or lost governments, and the narrative thickens as each symbol accumulates layers of speculative meaning. Conservators approach such ornament with a kind of quiet detective work. They analyze pigments, stone types, and bonding agents. They look for traces of paint beneath stone, the fingerprints of craftsmen, and the patina of age. These small clues help to build a careful chronology of construction and repair, revealing that many buildings are palimpsests of styles and epochs. The existence of multiple phases of work undermines any neat story of a single originating architecture, but to those who love mystery, the palimpsest is itself alluring. Layered histories can be read as coded messages from a prior world. In mapping the spread of architectural motifs, it helps to follow the networks that moved them. Trade routes, pilgrim paths, colonial expeditions, and migrating craftsmen all shuttle style and technique from place to place. When a trader from the Mediterranean meets a mason from Central Asia, their conversation will inevitably shape the buildings they later propose. These interactions are messy and incremental, not the product of top-down orders from a central command. But they can create the impression, in hindsight, of a pan-regional aesthetic that some will insist must have been directed by a single, vast polity. The question of materials is central to any architectural story. Stone, brick, timber, iron, and later steel and glass each tell a different tale of availability, climate, and technical knowledge. A region rich in limestone will favor carved stone facades. A place with abundant timber will produce ornate wooden eaves and intricate joinery. A city with access to ironworks will experiment with long spans and skeletal frameworks. The materials themselves thus confine and enable certain architectural responses, and yet those responses can be strikingly similar across different contexts because similar problems yield similar solutions. Hydraulics and urban infrastructure add another layer of complexity. Access to water determines settlement patterns and architectural decisions, and the presence of canals, aqueducts, and sophisticated drainage systems speaks to organized labor and engineering knowledge. Some Tartarian narratives locate advanced waterworks as the backbone of the lost civilization, pointing to grand sluices, dockworks, and canalized rivers in old maps. The evidence for complex hydraulic systems is real in many places, but engineering prowess emerges from incremental learning and local experimentation as often as from centralized planning. A sense of scale returns when you think about labor. The construction of a cathedral or fortress requires not only material wealth but an organized workforce, supply chains, and managerial oversight. Guilds, municipal governments, religious orders, and private patrons all play roles. The presence of such institutions explains how massive projects could be undertaken in diverse locales without invoking the idea of a single global government. Yet the human capacity to coordinate remains remarkable. Entire populations would pivot resources to sustain monumental projects. And that civic surrender to architecture is precisely what makes these buildings so potent to our imaginations. The acoustic properties of cathedrals are themselves a form of design. Architects adjusted vaulting and surfaces to enhance chant and organ. A vaulted ceiling can amplify a human voice into something resonant and ethereal, and sacred music was written to inhabit those spaces. The effect is visceral. When sound floats in a vaulted space, it feels as though the architecture collaborates in the ritual. For those who visit these places, the resonance acts as a proof of their original purpose and significance, reinforcing the idea that such places were built to house something larger than ordinary life. Star forts, in addition to being visual marvels, were designed with movement in mind. The angles allow defenders to run along ramparts and to position artillery where it could sweep approaches without exposing personnel excessively. The geometry also permitted control of landscape vistas, turning defense into display. In peaceful times, the earthworks softened into gardens. In tense times, they bristled with cannon and watchtowers. This duality, a structure that could be martial and bucolic, adds to their mystery and to the sense that these spaces were meant to be polyvalent, capable of many uses across time. World fairs were laboratories for ephemeral technologies, and many structures showcased materials and methods that would soon become ubiquitous. The use of cast iron and plate glass in large spans, the experimentation with prefabricated elements, and the theatrical deployment of colored light all informed the later development of modern architecture. Visitors left with ideas, and those ideas were applied in factories, train stations, and civic buildings. The fairs crystallized a faith in progress that would move architectural practice toward standardization and scalability, a fact that sometimes contradicts the narrative of impotent, vanished technological civilizations. Maps have been weaponized in the story of Tartaria. Old cartography, with its blank spaces and imperial delineations, feeds speculation. The presence of huge, loosely defined territories labeled Tartary or Tartaria in early maps contributed to a mythic geography, a set of possibilities for those who prefer broad explanations to granular history. Yet mapmakers worked with incomplete knowledge and the cartographic conventions of their time. A large name on a map often indicated an area of limited European knowledge rather than a centrally governed empire. Understanding map-making practices offers a more sober reading than supposing that grand labels on paper represent cohesive political control. Memory and forgetting operate differently across social groups. Elites leave archives, contracts, and ledgers. Common laborers leave fewer written traces but often leave durable physical work. Buildings thus become archives for those without paper. This inversion matters for how histories are written. If a physical monument survives but the bureaucratic records vanish, the monument can be misread by later interpreters. The paradox is that the very permanence of stone can mislead, offering a visual continuity that disguises social and political ruptures. The way cities mutate over time is also instructive. Urban centers are palimpsests of function and form, where streets migrate, docks silt up, and markets shift locations based on trade flows. A grand building may appear out of scale when the economic base of a city collapses or migrates. Some interpret this as proof of decline or erasure by an unseen force. More often, it is simply the ebb and flow of economic fortune and the local consequences of larger technological shifts, such as the rerouting of trade by railways or the industrial concentration of production. Photography and the internet changed the life of these images, amplifying anomalies and elevating them into viral curiosities. A postcard showing a large, ornate building with bricked windows becomes a meme, and the meme acquires a set of assumptions through repetition. People share images for effect and for narrative confirmation. They select what fits their story and ignore the rest. This selective attention fuels the narrative of a vanished world, where every unusual photograph becomes a clue in a detective story that resists conventional historical method. Academic historians respond with patient excavation of context. They trace ownership records, building permits, and renovation logs. They read not just what is visible but why it is visible now and not then. Preservationists catalog restorations and retrofit histories, establishing timelines that explain what is built, when it was built, and how its function changed. These mundane records rarely produce the romantic sweep of a vanished empire, but they do reveal the rich, complex webs that produce architecture. Yet there is power in stories, too. The Tartarian hypothesis taps into a yearning for connection to something larger than the fragmentary present. It is comforting to imagine a past in which architecture manifested a coherent human project, a globally shared style representing unity of spirit and capacity. Legends often do social work, giving communities an origin story or a claim to dignity. The fascination can therefore be read as a cultural response to modern fragmentation, a way of stitching meaning back into places that feel stranded in the aftershock of rapid social change. Moving from myth to craft, we can examine the methods of masonry that made cathedrals possible. Stone cutting advanced slowly, from rough rubble to finely dressed ashlar. The ability to shape stones accurately allowed for tighter joints and greater heights, and eventually for the creation of complex vaults. Masons used templates and full-scale drawings on tracing floors, and teams specialized in different parts of construction, quarries, dressing yards, hoisting systems. The coordination of these specialized skills made monumental building feasible in an era without modern machinery. Scaffolding itself is an ancient art. To raise a vault, you need a temporary wooden framework that supports centering until the keystone locks everything in place. These timber scaffolds were engineering feats in their own right, sometimes reused in campaigns across years or even decades. The temporary is an integral part of the permanent. Without it, the monumental cannot be achieved. Once built, the scaffolding becomes invisible to the casual observer, but it is an essential chapter in the story of creation. The logistics of moving stone and timber were Herculean. River transport and sledges carried tons of material, and the landscape constrained such movement. Bridges, canals, and roads had to be in place or built concurrently, linking quarries to sites. The investment in infrastructure for a single building project could transform a local economy. This explains why rulers and religious institutions were willing to commit enormous resources. Construction projects were as much about stimulating trade and demonstrating control as about creating spiritual or military monuments. Inscriptions on buildings provide another route into history. Dates, donor names, and patronage statements often survive, carved into lintels or foundation stones. Epigraphic evidence can be stubbornly precise in a way that the romance of Tartaria is not. When careful historians read inscriptions in their original languages, they reconstruct not merely a date but the social relations behind the build, who paid, who labored, who was honored. It is a reminder that behind every monumental facade there is an economy of obligations and favors. Religious patronage cannot be understated. Churches and cathedrals were often funded by powerful patrons seeking eternal memory or political legitimacy. Royals, merchant guilds, and aristocrats competed in a pious arms race, endowing chapels and commissioning altarpieces. That competition produced architectural booms and stylistic flamboyance, and often produced buildings of scale disproportionate to their civic population. For observers blinded by scale alone, the explanation appears conspiratorial, but the archival record of patronage is one of the most ordinary and human explanations available. The aesthetic vocabulary of ornament deserves its own attentive listening. Grotesques and gargoyles, for instance, are not merely decorative, they express a medieval visual syntax that conflates the sacred and the profane, the monstrous and the comic. Gargoyles serve as waterspouts, but their sculptural forms also acted as moral instruction and warding figures. Similarly, friezes and figurative sculpture narrate origin myths, victories, and local legends. Each decorative program is a curated message, not the uniform insignia of a centralized state. Public spaces complete the picture. Squares, plazas, amphitheaters, and promenades structure civic life and provide settings for ceremonies. A cathedral frequently anchors a city's most important square, and a star fort often obligates a layout of barracks, storehouses, and arcades. World fairs, in contrast, create temporary spaces of spectacle that can later be tentatively reincorporated into urban life. The way people occupy these spaces, parading, market trading, worshiping, or protesting, gives clues to the original social functions that fed into architectural choices. Transportation networks reshape buildings' fortunes. The rise of railways and later automobile infrastructure refocused trade flows, leaving some monuments stranded and elevating others. A coastal city once booming as a port can stagnate when shipping patterns change. A railway junction can suddenly make a once quiet town into an industrial hub. Buildings that once served a different economy suddenly appear mismatched to new uses, intensifying the feeling that they belong to another age. Those shifts explain much of the apparent anachronism that fuels alternate histories of Tartaria. Material science has its own narratives to add. Mortars change over time, from lime-based mixes to modern cement blends, and differential decay exposes phases of repair and alteration. Painted finishes can hide earlier decorative schemes, and later weathering may re-expose them. Conservators use microscopic analysis to sequence layers of paint and plaster, and those sequences reveal the long conversations that buildings hold across decades. The technical story of materials is therefore a human story as well, one of tastes, budgets, and the coevolution of technique. The environmental record is embedded in buildings too. Freeze-thaw cycles, salt crystallization, and biogrowth leave distinct signatures that correlate to climate and pollution histories. Industrial soot, for instance, blackened facades in the 19th century, altering the perceived color and character of stonework. Later cleaning campaigns restored a different appearance that sometimes shocked communities used to soot-darkened surfaces. These visible changes often get misinterpreted by later viewers who assume a sudden transformation rather than the slow accretion of environmental effects and remediation efforts. Archaeology contributes method and caution. Excavations around monumental ruins reveal foundations, post holes, and domestic debris that speak of daily life in ways facades cannot. A cathedral's neighboring alleyways may yield pottery sherds, food remains, and small tokens, reminding us that grand architecture was embedded in ordinary existence. This juxtaposition of the monumental and the mundane undermines a neat narrative of a uniform, top-down civilization and instead shows a tapestry of local lives interacting with monumental ambitions. Museums and collections play a role in memory-making as well. Objects taken from removed or repurposed buildings often end up in national collections, where they are cataloged and displayed with interpretive text. The removal of an altarpiece or a statue from its original context changes meaning in ways that can mislead later viewers. When objects are separated from architecture, narratives can be reshaped to fit national stories or modern aesthetics, sometimes obscuring the multivalent functions those works once held. Stories of catastrophe often appeal to the dramatic imagination, and so some Tartarian narratives invoke earthquakes, floods, or deliberate destruction to explain alterations. Natural disasters certainly have reshaped cities, and thousands of buildings bear scars of seismic events and flood histories. But catastrophic explanations are not universally applicable, and many modifications result from gradual political and economic shifts rather than a single apocalyptic event. A balanced view listens to both the drama of sudden events and the slow arc of social transformation. The historiography of imperialism matters for understanding why certain stories proliferate. Empires built monumental architectures to symbolize unity and authority, but they also suppressed local narratives and repurposed sacred spaces. Later national projects sometimes dismantled or reframed those architectural legacies to occupy the symbolic vacuum. When people look back at the palimpsest of empire, they sometimes see a monolith where only a sequence of contested meanings actually existed. That confusion opens a space for myths that imagine a single, coherent past. Material scarcity and the economics of demolition are part of the pragmatic story too. Dismantling a large stone building is laborious and expensive, and often it is the more adaptable buildings that survive through reuse. In many towns, demolition is a rarefied act. People repurpose rather than raise because recycling stone makes economic sense. That patchwork of reuse creates visual oddities, a bricked-up row of windows here, a new doorway cut into an old arcade there, which enthusiasts can read as conscious obliteration by a lost power. In truth, such alterations are typically the humdrum responses of people making do with what they have. The role of photography again deserves attention for the way images remove buildings from their operational contexts. A picture of a facade at a particular angle can obscure adjacent streets, signage, and human activity that would otherwise explain its scale and function. Cropped and captionless images float online, and they accumulate meanings through repetition divorced from context. That process has been central to creating narratives of a vanished age because images function as persuasive evidence even when their provenance is ambiguous. The interplay of narrative and evidence is where the story of Tartaria becomes most interesting. On one hand, there is a trove of fascinating architecture and urban forms that do suggest broad patterns and cross-cultural exchanges. On the other hand, rigorous explanation requires patient assembly of documents, building records, and technical analyses. Neither approach fully discredits the other. The stories we tell about the past are inevitably a blend of what is materially present and what the imagination contributes to fill gaps. Local mythologies often intertwine with the grander narratives. In many towns, oral histories and folk tales attribute monumental buildings to heroic founders, vanished orders, or enigmatic rulers. Those folk narratives persist even when written records contradict them, and they contribute to a cultural sense of mystery. Anthropologists find these stories valuable because they reveal how communities relate to their built environment. Where official histories are sparse or contested, oral tales become the connective tissue that holds community memory together. The pedagogical role of architecture is vital. Buildings teach values and norms across generations. A town hall announces civic virtue, a cathedral instructs through imagery, a citadel defines defense. The forms become mnemonic devices, teaching local history in stone. When such teaching is interrupted or redirected, communities can feel dislocated. The yearning for a recovered age, then, is partly a yearning for coherent pedagogy, for an architecture that tells you who you are in a language everyone recognizes. Conservation ethics introduce another dimension. Decisions about what to restore, what to preserve as ruin, and what to replace involve philosophical choices about authenticity. Some argue for minimal intervention to keep the historical narrative legible, others advocate for reconstruction to return a structure to an imagined original state. These debates mirror broader conflicts about loss and recovery that feed mythic thinking. The act of restoration itself can produce new layers of interpretation, sometimes blurring lines between history and homage. Legal frameworks shape the fate of many buildings too. Heritage laws, zoning regulations, and property rights determine whether a structure can be altered or dismantled. In some cases, early 20th century regimes demolished older neighborhoods in the name of hygiene or modernization, producing abrupt losses that feed conspiratorial thinking. In other cases, protective legislation preserved urban fabrics that might otherwise have vanished. The uneven application of such laws across regions complicates any single narrative of decline or disappearance. Folkloric and symbolic readings of architecture persist in how people talk about buildings. A cathedral is not only a place of worship but a vessel for collective identity. A fortress is not merely a defense but a civic anchor. These meanings are layered upon functional descriptions and sometimes persist far longer than the functions themselves. Cultural attachment to form can therefore outlast political and economic structures, generating nostalgia that sometimes takes the shape of myths about a lost, purer past. Tourism reshapes perceptions too. When tourists visit a site, their gaze and expectations influence what is preserved and how it is framed. Interpretive plaques, guided tours, and souvenir markets all create a narrative for consumption. Over time, the tourist narrative can overshadow local narratives, leading to a curated heritage that reflects external desires more than internal histories. This commercialization of memory has the double effect of preserving structures while also simplifying or romanticizing their histories, which in turn fuels speculation about vanished grandeur. Language and terminology matter when we talk about an imagined empire like Tartaria. The word itself carries a luminous vagueness that allows multiple meanings to cluster around it. It functions as a label for an aggregation of anomalies and a vessel for longing. Language enables myth to coagulate. It allows disparate architectural features to be strung into a synthetic narrative. Recognizing how terminology shapes perception is a step toward understanding how certain hypotheses gain traction. The relationship between science and belief is central to the debate. Archaeology and architectural history rely on empirical methods, stratigraphy, and documentary evidence. Myths of lost ages invoke inference, pattern recognition, and sometimes wishful thinking. Both approaches respond to uncertainty but in different register. Science seeks to narrow uncertainty through evidence, while myth often embraces uncertainty as a space for meaning. The tension is not new. It is part of human intellectual life and enriches our cultural conversation about the past. Consider the emotional valence of ruins themselves. A ruin is both a remnant and a mirror, reflecting back our fears and desires for permanence. Walking among ruins, people project narratives of decline, resilience, or cyclical rebirth. That projection animates the stones and makes them speak. For many, the romance of Tartaria is less about proving a thesis than about experiencing that projection in a way that binds people together in shared wonder. In urban planning terms, monumental architecture is also a tool of modern nation building. Newly formed states in the 19th and 20th centuries often erected grand public buildings to signal legitimacy and continuity with historical grandeur. These acts were deliberate attempts to locate modern nations within broader architectural traditions, and they often borrowed liberally from previous styles to create a sense of antiquity. The result can be a palimpsest that blurs chronological clarity and invites the misreading that certain structures belong to a far earlier, unified past. The circulation of craftsmen is a subtle but powerful explanation for stylistic similarities across regions. Highly skilled masons, plasterers, and carpenters often traveled following commissions, carrying techniques and motifs with them. Apprenticeships could last years, and a master craftsman moving from city to city would naturally transfer stylistic preferences along with technical knowledge. This human migration of skill offers a humane and realistic counterpoint to grand theories of centralized empire. Powerful individuals and families also leave outsized legacies in stone. Patrons built, then their names endured long after their political lines faded. These buildings often outlast the social networks that created them, and their physical endurance makes them appear to belong to a vanished epoch. The existence of durable patronage networks explains how monumental projects coalesced without invoking the idea of a single, world-spanning authority. The cultural politics of reconstruction have produced controversies. Rebuilding a destroyed cathedral can be an act of restitution and identity, but it can also be criticized as creating an inauthentic past. Decisions about whether to imitate old techniques or to use modern materials often hinge on local values, economics, and the desires of stakeholders. Each choice reworks the story that the building will tell future generations, and thus architecture becomes an ongoing conversation between past intentions and present agency. Political violence can scar architecture in ways that are both literal and metaphorical. Wars, revolutions, and iconoclasm leave visible marks, gunshot pockmarks, burned timbers, and deliberately dismantled statues. These traces can be read as chapters in a contested history, and they often become central to how communities remember conflict. The visible damage fosters narratives of loss that can be co-opted into broader mythologies about erased civilizations or deliberate conspiracies. The economics of tourism sometimes incentivize exaggerated narratives. A claim of mysterious origins or grand lost empires draws attention and visitors. Local economies can rely on that attention, and narratives can morph to satisfy market demand. This commodification of mystery complicates the truth-seeking impulse, because economic incentives often reward spectacular claims more than careful scholarship. Local archives, when accessible, provide ballast to speculative stories. Municipal ledgers, guild records, and notarial documents can clarify who paid for construction, how costs were met, and how responsibilities were distributed. These records often tell a less glamorous but more accurate story of incremental investment and civic negotiation. For those willing to do the archival work, Much of the romance of unified, vanished empires dissolves into the human-scale realities of contracts and budgets. Yet the human appetite for meaning persists. Even when archives provide mundane explanations, people prefer the sweep of legends because they connect the local to the cosmic. The narrative of a vanished Tartaria offers belonging and mystery, and that emotional pull must be reckoned with alongside empirical claims. The discipline of history coexists with the human need to mythologize, and the friction between them creates a space rich in stories, both verified and imagined. A final measure of these debates is how they illuminate our present. The architecture we inherit is a sum of choices made by past people under particular constraints. How we interpret those choices reveals our own values and anxieties. The yearning for grand unity in architecture reflects contemporary desires for coherence in a fragmented world. Whether Tartaria is an invented empire or a metaphor for lost continuity, the fascination with cathedrals, star forts, and world fairs teaches us something important about how humans relate to space, memory, and time. The photograph is grainy, a black and white postcard pulled from a flea market or an old family album, and for reasons that have nothing to do with its original purpose it becomes a key. People study it the way detectives study a crime scene, tugging at a balustrade here, tracing a broken cornice there. They see a world that feels too grand, too ornate, as if some civilization built cathedrals and palaces and then simply disappeared. That sensation, the mix of wonder and unease, is where many stories begin, and it is where the story of Tartaria begins for a great many who encountered one of those photographs late at night on a folding screen. You could be driving or doing dishes when you first hear the name, and it will arrive as a bold claim, a massive empire erased from the official record, its monuments repurposed or hidden away, its maps scrubbed. The claim asks for suspicion toward archives and official narratives, and it rewards curiosity with the thrill of being the one who sees what others have missed. What follows is less a single argument than a stack of anomalies pressed together until a new shape forms, and that shape demands we ask two questions at once. Was something suppressed, or were these anomalies simply misread, knitted into something they were never meant to show? To answer that, we need to step inside places that most of us visit only when researching a paper or tracing a family tree: archives, libraries, municipal record rooms, and the cabinets of museums. These places are messy in ways that surprise those who think of them as temples of order. Papers arrive without provenance, misfiled boxes wait for sorting, documents lose their context, and photographs are detached from the stories that once anchored them. Far from a conspiracy, these realities are the ordinary work of information management, and they breed gaps that invite speculation. An anomaly is not, in itself, a proof of cover-up. An anomaly is a gap with edges, an odd term in a ledger, a building whose basement seems to begin 3 stories above the street, a map with a name that no historian recognizes. We are wired to connect edges, to make patterns from partial information, and sometimes our pattern-making fills in the wrong way. The question becomes who benefits from that filling in and whether the people pointing at anomalies are seeking truth, attention, or both. The word Tartaria itself has a long history in European maps and travel accounts dating to a time when the continent east of Russia was poorly known to Western cartographers. For centuries, Europeans used broad, imprecise names for vast regions, and Tartary or Tartaria was one of those names, a catch-all for expanses inhabited by diverse peoples. That historical usage is an important anchor because it shows that the name was never a precise polity like France or Ming China, but rather a vague label applied by outsiders. When that vague label is pulled out of context and grafted onto ornate photos and speculative timelines, it acquires a new life entirely different from its original purpose. Maps themselves are often accused of being instruments of erasure, and rightly so in many contexts where borders were drawn to marginalize peoples. Yet maps are also conversations with imperfection. Surveyors mismeasured, printers made errors, and explorers guessed at coasts and rivers. Old atlases sometimes display islands that later vanish, names that drift, and peoples described through exotic lenses. These inconsistencies are not proof that a mapmaker conspired to hide Tartaria. They are proof of how knowledge was produced, slowly, tentatively, and often in response to incomplete data. Photographs awaken a different set of doubts because they offer a feeling of immediacy. A sepia image of a domed building looks like proof of advanced architecture at a time when the story being told says such architecture should not exist. But photographs are also contextless if divorced from captions, negatives, dates, and catalog entries. A grand hotel from 1895 placed beside a modern building can look like a relic of a vanished civilization if you ignore travel, trade, and the rapid growth of urban design in the 19th century. Photos seduce the eye, and when the eye is hungry for mystery, it feeds on what it finds. One of the more persistent ideas tied to Tartaria is the mudflood theory, the notion that a sudden catastrophe buried entire cities under layers of mud, and that modern engineers and rulers covered up the evidence. The theory relies on interpreting visible basements and first floors as signs of buried stories. Yet those architectural oddities often have mundane explanations: changes in street level over decades, intentional raising for drainage, or later renovations that left earlier facades intact while the ground around them shifted. The narrative power of a sudden global catastrophe is hard to resist, but its explanatory economy doesn't stand up to the messy, incremental ways cities evolve. We should consider how photographs of ornate buildings, once separated from captions, find new narratives when placed beside maps and curiosities. An intact palace in an industrial sidebar, a Russian cathedral in an American postcard, these juxtapositions feed a story that wants breadth and totality. When curiosity merges with a thirst for counter-narrative, the idea that official histories are hiding something vast, the pieces cohere into a drama that explains everything you unearthed and leaves a lot unexplained. That coherence is persuasive. The lack of nuance is not always immediately noticed. The role of archives is central because they are the repositories that either confirm or complicate claims. Archives are not neutral. They were built by people with priorities, biases, and limited resources. Colonizers cataloged subjects differently from those cataloged by colonized communities. Fires and wars destroyed vast quantities of material that might have clarified historical pictures. Yet the absence of evidence in an archive is often silence rather than erasure, and silence is ambivalent. It can mean deliberate suppression, it can mean loss, or it can mean something as simple as a clerk's oversight. When someone claims that an archive has been deliberately purged to erase Tartaria, they ask us to accept an extraordinary scale of coordination across time and institutions. Imagine librarians and civil servants across continents agreeing, generations apart, to alter catalogs and burn documents so thoroughly that not a single reliable trace remains. Such a concerted effort is not impossible in fiction, but in historical practice it is rare and logistically improbable. What is far more common is selective loss, records kept about subjects that mattered to the bureaucrats of the day, and records neglected for lack of perceived importance. It is worth tracing how anomalies move from niche curiosity into viral claims. YouTube channels, social feeds, and forums assemble images, maps, and excerpts into persuasive narratives. A video editor pairs a photograph of a grand dome with a cold, authoritative voice and a pulsing soundtrack, and the result feels like revelation. Algorithms reward engagement, and engagement often spikes with mystery. That combination pushes marginal ideas into the mainstream faster than the slow, patient work of archivists can correct misreadings. Conspiracies flourish in environments where trust in institutions is low. This is not an argument about gullibility but about social context. When people live in eras of rapid change, industrial shifts, political crises, pandemics, their relationship to authority frays. Archives and official histories then appear as instruments of a distant power, and stories of hidden empires fill the space where trust used to be. The narrative appeal of a suppressed past is not only emotional, it is generative. It gives people a sense of having discovered something that returns control to them, even if that sense is illusory. We cannot discuss Tartaria without thinking about architecture as language. Columns, domes, and arches speak of styles that travel across borders through trade, migration, and shared ideas. The presence of a neoclassical facade in a Siberian town is not evidence of an isolated empire with forgotten technology, it is evidence of exchange. Architectural forms spread like words, and builders borrowed and adapted. To read architectural similarity as proof of a single lost civilization is to forget that style migrates as readily as people do. Another reason Tartaria narratives stick is the human tendency to prefer total explanations over probabilistic ones. The world is complex, and a neat origin story that explains multiple anomalies at once is satisfying. The mind prefers a single narrative thread to a tapestry of contingencies. This cognitive bias is not an indictment, it is simply a fact of how we process information. The trick for a careful listener is to hold a compelling narrative alongside a skeptical set of questions and to weigh evidence rather than emotion. Historians operate differently. They collect layers of evidence: tax records, letters, building permits, newspapers, photographs, and more. Each source carries its own weaknesses, and the historian compensates by interlocking them. When a building appears majestic in a photograph, a permit might show who commissioned it, a ledger might list the workers, and a census could indicate the population of the town. None of these sources are flawless, but together they build a lattice of plausibility. That lattice is messy because history itself is messy, which is why neat conspiracies rarely fit when examined closely. Part of the allure of Tartaria is its inclusivity. It is a blank canvas large enough to host many grievances and fantasies, lost technologies, worldwide cover-ups, architectural marvels built by forgotten masters. Because it is vague by design, it can incorporate disparate anomalies without being pinned down. This vagueness is a rhetorical advantage, protecting the idea from specific falsification. If someone points out that a particular building has a known architect, the narrative simply expands to say that the architect copied or repurposed Tartarian designs. The theory's elasticity makes it resilient to counterexamples. The Internet changes the dynamics of verification. On one hand, digitization has brought archives to screens, and more documents are searchable than ever. On the other hand, the sheer volume of material can overwhelm, and snippets taken out of context can appear authoritative. A magazine reference from 1892 found on a digitized page can be misread if the reader ignores the surrounding paragraphs. Digital collections are powerful corrective tools when used carefully, yet they can be turned into a buffet of fragments that feed speculative appetites. Consider the role of language barriers in the formation of misinterpretations. Many original documents needed to assess claims about places labeled Tartary are in languages less accessible to English-speaking audiences: Russian, Persian, Chinese, and various Turkic tongues. Translational gaps create silences and misprisions. A term translated loosely as a region or a tribe can be read by someone else as the name of a state. Those small shifts in meaning can accumulate until a geography is reconstructed that never existed in the way the claimant imagines. It is also instructive to look at similar movements in the past. Other supposed lost civilizations have captured imaginations: Atlantis, Hyperborea, and Mu, to name a few. Each story mirrors a cultural anxiety of its time and serves as a repository of hopes and fears. Atlantis surfaced in times when people questioned imperial power, while Hyperborea appealed to nationalistic myth-making. Tartaria, by contrast, has flourished in the era of digital connectivity, where images travel faster than expert rebuttals. The pattern repeats. Anomalies become mythic when they fill a present-day need. We should not dismiss every question about archives and suppression as paranoia. Archives have been instrumentalized historically. Authorities have destroyed texts, changed catalog entries, and curated collections that reflect power. Libraries and records have been burned in wars and by zealots. Where there is precedent for cultural erasure, suspicion is reasonable. But reasonable suspicion requires careful, document-rooted claims. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary provenance, not the emotional cadence of a nighttime documentary. A careful listener will notice that many proponents of Tartaria rely on a method that is the inverse of archival practice, accumulation without synthesis. They gather images and oddities and present them as if their accumulation were itself proof. In archival work, accumulation only begins the job. The historian asks questions of each piece: who created it, who kept it, who ignored it, and why. Without that interrogative frame, an archive of anomalies is a mirror that only reflects what the compiler is willing to see. Sometimes, though, anomalies point to real historical puzzles that deserve further study. There are towns that experienced rapid rebuilding, mysterious spikes in population, and sudden changes in economic patterns that invite legitimate investigation. Scholars who treat these puzzles as opportunities rather than confirmations of a pre-existing narrative contribute more to knowledge. The difference between legitimate curiosity and conspiracy is methodological rigor. Curiosity asks for evidence, conspiracy declares it. It is worth pausing on the human element behind the spread of Tartaria ideas. Many voices that amplified the myth did not begin as deceivers, but as seekers who found a picture or a map that moved them. The internet rewards storytelling, and an emotionally compelling account will be shared more than a careful footnote. People who want to feel part of a revealing conversation often become evangelists, spreading the theory with the fervor of converts. That zeal can obscure critical thinking, yet it also points to a deep cultural need for meaning and belonging. Journalism and scholarship respond to these needs differently. A journalist might produce a sympathetic profile of someone who believes in Tartaria, presenting empathy alongside facts. A scholar might publish a long article tracing the provenance of a single image across archives and languages. Both approaches are valuable because they illuminate different aspects of the phenomenon, the social psychology and the documentary reality. Each page pulled from an archive chips away at confusion or builds a new story, depending on how it is interpreted. Another thread in the story is technological misunderstanding. Contemporary observers sometimes assume that pre-industrial societies could not have built grand things, and so when they see grand buildings from the 19th century, they imagine a lost older civilization. This underestimates human ingenuity and the history of technology. The 19th century was a time of rapid engineering strides, iron framing, steam-powered construction, and transnational exchange of design ideas. What looks impossible to an unobservant eye often requires only a little architectural literacy to explain. When you track an image back to a maker, a different story often emerges. A hotel built in the 1880s can be traced through trade catalogs, municipal licenses, and newspaper clippings. Travel literature of the day described buildings in detail, and postcards advertised cities to prospective visitors. The documentary chain that seems invisible at first often reveals itself when someone takes the time to look for exclusions rather than coincidences. That time and care are what separate a hobbyist's conclusion from a historian's account. The appeal of suppression narratives is enhanced by the romance of the archive itself, the idea that somewhere, in a forgotten basement, is a drawer that contains all the lost truth. That image is intoxicating because it promises resolution without the messy work of interpretation. It is hard to look at a list of cataloged items and see the marvel of contingency, the letter misfiled by a tired clerk, the photograph whose caption wandered off with the album. The mythical drawer simplifies and flattens the complex reality of records management into a single object of revelation. Conspiracies are also cultural artifacts with their own life cycles. They grow, mutate, and sometimes fade away, only to reappear in new forms. Tartaria may be a modern incarnation of older impulses, but its future depends on social rhythms. If new documents are digitized and made accessible, if scholars publish clear refutations, and if cultural educators make spaces for curiosity without credulity, the narrative may lose momentum. But if archives remain opaque and trust erodes further, the theory will adapt and survive in other shapes. We should also look at the economic forces that shape both archives and conspiracy culture. Maintaining archives is expensive. Governments and institutions must prioritize. When budgets are cut, archives get less staff and fewer resources, and their backlogs become longer. That scarcity makes it easier for people to claim, without proof, that something is being hidden. The true culprit is often neglect, not malevolent intent. Yet neglect is itself a political choice, and it raises legitimate questions about which histories we value. The internet complicates the economics by turning attention into currency. A provocative theory attracts viewers, clicks, and monetizable engagement. The incentives are not designed to reward nuance. Content producers who package a big idea neatly are often more profitable than those who offer slow, patient correction. That mismatch between public incentives and epistemic virtues is a structural issue that no single correction can fully resolve. Still, awareness of the incentive structure helps explain why certain claims gain traction so quickly. We can examine specific case studies to see how the narrative works in practice. Take a city with 19th century buildings that now have doors leading to what appears to be the second floor. Urban development often leaves traces like raised sidewalks and buried thresholds. An investigator who visits a municipal office may find permits from decades earlier documenting street-level changes due to sewer construction or to canal infilling. Those mundane facts rarely make the dramatic video cut, yet they are the actual mechanisms of change. Another case study involves maps that show regions labeled Tartaria. A close reading reveals that mapmakers used the term differently at different times. Travelers' reports, hearsay, and hearsay of hearsay often made their way onto maps, particularly in the margins of unknown regions. Scholars of cartography have long argued that such labels are evidence of ignorance rather than erasure. They show where the mapmaker's knowledge stopped, not where truth was being hidden. A telling moment in studying these archives is how corrections are made and recorded. Printers issued errata, later map editions changed names, and travel accounts were revised by later editors. If someone wanted to erase an entire civilization, they would have to coordinate across these revisions in ways that are not supported by the documentary record. More plausibly, map names change as knowledge advances, and later cartographers simply replaced vague labels with more specific ones as they learned more about a region. That is progress, not conspiracy. The story also touches on forgeries and hoaxes, which exist in any information ecosystem. Collections sometimes contain fabricated documents created for profit or notoriety. Forgeries can fool experts temporarily and mislead the public for longer. Detecting forgeries requires expertise in ink, paper, handwriting, and context. Forgeries are real, but their existence does not confirm a global purge. It illustrates that the historical record is contested and that careful methods are required to separate the genuine from the fake. Museums play a role too, sometimes inadvertently. Exhibits designed for spectacle can strip objects of context to make a dramatic point. A grand building repurposed as an exhibit backdrop may end up decoupled from its provenance, and visitors may take the spectacle as a clue to some hidden order. Curators face a tension between making exhibits engaging and preserving nuance. When spectacle overrides context, the public's imagination fills the vacuum with stories that may not align with archival facts. The social dynamics of belief are important. Belonging is a powerful motivator, and a shared suspicion of official narratives creates a community. People swap photographs, share theories, and celebrate when a skeptical article rolls out as if each refutation is a small victory against a common enemy. Those social bonds reinforce the narrative, making it harder for individuals to break away. Understanding the social element helps explain why some adherents remain committed even when central claims are debunked. Attempts to correct misinformation face their own pitfalls. Fact-checking often takes a tone of moral superiority that communities perceive as hostile or paternalistic. Corrections that only ridicule or dismiss can backfire, deepening mistrust. Successful correction tends to be modest and evidence-rich, showing patiently how particular claims are mistaken and offering alternative explanations. That approach is slower and less dramatic, but it is more likely to persuade those who are uncertain. There is a philosophical layer to the dispute that concerns what counts as authority. Some proponents of Tartaria reject mainstream academic authority outright, seeing universities and museums as complicit in a sanitized narrative. That rejection is part of a larger skepticism about elitism, and it has legitimate roots in histories of exclusion and exploitation. The problem arises when skepticism turns into an automatic dismissal of expertise, because expertise, properly applied, is a method for testing claims. The challenge is to hold expertise accountable without discarding it entirely. We should also explore how national identity can be entwined with these narratives. In some contexts, claims about a great lost empire feed nationalist fantasies about a glorious past that has been stolen or suppressed. Conversely, other groups may use the idea to question the narratives of colonial powers. That flexibility explains why Tartaria attracts a broad range of political sympathies. The same narrative can be folded into different ideologies because its vagueness allows multiple interpretations. A careful narrative considers the ethics of dealing with cultural heritage. When people assert that monuments were repurposed from a conquered civilization, they imply a history of violence and dispossession. Those claims, if false, risk misrepresenting the suffering of real peoples. Conversely, ignoring legitimate grievances about heritage erasure similarly does harm. The ethical stance is to allow room for correction while taking claims about heritage seriously enough to investigate properly. Respect for the dead and for descendant communities must temper our curiosity. Archives themselves are evolving in ways that affect how history is written. Digital preservation, open data initiatives, and crowdsourcing projects expand access but also raise questions about curation. Not everything that is digitized is contextualized. Search engines prioritize matching words over interpreting meaning, which favors sensational associations. Archivists now face a new responsibility, not only to preserve but to provide interpretive frameworks that help the public understand what documents mean in context. This responsibility extends to education. Teaching critical reading skills, source evaluation, and historical thinking is crucial to resisting the allure of blanket explanations. Schools that foster a sense of wonder about the past while training students in methods to test claims give people tools to sift evidence. That training is not a cure-all. It does not make people impervious to seductive narratives. But it helps create a public less likely to conclude that mystery is proof. Of course, there are episodes in history where evidence has indeed been suppressed. Governments have classified documents that later revealed wrongdoing, and archives sometimes conceal painful truths for decades. Those real acts of suppression justify a healthy skepticism and a watchful eye. However, the existence of suppression in some cases should not be taken as proof that all gaps result from the same cause. Each claim needs examination on its own documentary merits. The tale of Tartaria also invites us to reflect on the nature of evidence itself. Evidence is not simply the presence of an image or a phrase, it is the relationship among sources. A photograph gains meaning when connected to a ledger, and a ledger gains plausibility when matched with census data. Building these networks takes time and expertise. The more ad hoc the connections, the more fragile the conclusion. Those who enjoy detective stories must be wary of constructing elaborate cases out of a few shards. There is an artistic dimension to the phenomenon as well. Some creators take Tartaria as a canvas for speculative fiction and alternate histories, and in that realm the idea can be captivating and harmless. Fiction can explore themes of memory, erasure, and architecture without asserting historical claims. The problem emerges when these imaginative works are passed off as evidence. Distinguishing between creative myth-making and claims of factual recovery is part of the cultural literacy we need more of. As we listen, it is helpful to consider stories of people who shifted from belief to skepticism because of archival work. Many started with images that captivated them and then pursued the paperwork, the microfilm, and the rental ledgers until they found chains of custody. Those researchers often describe a surprising sense of anticlimax, the slow dissolving of a bold story into a series of ordinary bureaucratic acts. Yet that anticlimax is in itself a kind of beauty, a reminder that the past is made of lived complexity rather than monolithic secrets. There is also the emotional arc of discovery to consider. Curiosity turns to obsession, obsession to community, and community to identity. People tell stories about the moment they first felt the thrill, and those origin tales become part of the lore. Understanding that arc helps us empathize with believers without validating claims uncritically. Empathy allows us to engage rather than to dismiss, creating a space for conversation where evidence might move minds rather than entrench positions. One of the more interesting strands is how professional practices can unintentionally feed conspiracies. Archivists and curators sometimes use technical shorthand in catalogs that appears cryptic to outsiders. A label that reads uncertain provenance or misattributed artist can be read as deliberate obfuscation. The truth is often professional caution rather than maliciousness. Experts flag uncertainties rather than invent facts. Educating the public about these professional conventions would reduce misinterpretation. In parallel, social media platforms are experimenting with ways to reduce the spread of misinformation, but their solutions are uneven. Some deploy fact-check labels, others alter algorithms to reduce engagement with dubious content. Those steps have modest effects because misinformation often thrives in communities that distrust external policing. The most effective interventions are those that combine platform adjustments with grassroots educational work and transparent archival outreach. Neither technology nor institutions alone will solve the problem. It is instructive to think about how national archives in different countries handle contested narratives. Some nations open their collections and invite scholarship, others restrict access for political reasons. Comparative study shows that where archives are open, claims about suppressed empires are more easily tested and often fail. Where archives are closed, speculation fills the void. Transparency is not a panacea, but it reduces the structural opportunities for unchecked claims to flourish. At the heart of this story is the human desire for wholeness. We want origin stories that make sense of mystery and give coherence to uneven lives. The idea of a vanished grand empire promises meaning in a world that often feels incoherent. Recognizing the desire helps us address it compassionately. Providing better narratives that satisfy curiosity without sacrificing accuracy may be one of the most humane ways to counteract grand conspiracies. That task falls to many actors, teachers, archivists, journalists, community leaders, and tech designers. Each has a role in building a public culture of thoughtful skepticism. Archivists can contextualize collections, teachers can cultivate critical literacy, journalists can resist the urge to sensationalize. None of these roles is glamorous, but collectively they fortify the social immune system against seductive falsehoods. The work is slow, patient, and cumulative, like the best kind of research. The story of Tartaria reveals more about us than it does about a hidden civilization. It shows how the present shapes our reading of the past, how social anxieties find expression in narratives, and how technology accelerates the circulation of claims before they can be tested. That observation is not meant to delegitimize curiosity but to orient it. Curiosity paired with method becomes inquiry. Curiosity without method becomes myth-making. We should also consider the consequences of embracing a false narrative. Belief in a suppressed Tartaria can redirect energy away from addressing real injustices in the present, economic inequality, cultural erasure by recognizable actors, and the real material neglect of archives. It can also expose adherents to scams and disinformation campaigns that profit from their credulity. The consequences are tangible, and they affect communities and institutions alike. Still, the phenomenon has produced some positive outcomes. It has led people to seek out archives, to photograph old buildings, and to learn the basics of historical investigation. In this way, even mistaken theories can catalyze a renewed interest in the past. The key is to channel that interest toward rigorous methods. Enthusiasm for history is a resource. It only becomes destructive when untethered from evidence. There are also methodological lessons for scholars gleaned from this episode. Researchers must make provenance and context clearer, write accessibly, and engage publicly without condescension. When scholarship remains trapped behind academic paywalls and niche journals, those spaces are surrendered to more flamboyant narratives. Public-facing scholarship that explains uncertainties and complexities in clear language helps inoculate against oversimplified alternatives. One fertile ground for improvement is better digitization practices that preserve context alongside content. When images are uploaded, captions, catalog records, and links to related documents should accompany them. A photograph on a social feed without metadata is like a story told without setting. Good metadata helps reconstruct the chain of provenance and reduces the likelihood that a single image will be misread into a grand narrative. We should not ignore the entertainment economy either. People love mysteries, and the entertainment industry sometimes amplifies fringe theories because they make compelling television. Producers often prioritize drama over accuracy, and audiences sometimes accept dramatized reconstructions as evidence. Media literacy is the antidote. Knowing how documentaries are made and recognizing the difference between entertainment and scholarship can help listeners and viewers maintain perspective. Dialogue matters. Conversations between skeptics and believers that begin in good faith can be productive. Combative encounters tend to harden positions, while curious exchanges can open doorways to reconsideration. Listening without immediate dismissal allows space for questions to be answered. The aim is not to shame but to illuminate, and sometimes illumination comes slowly through several small corrections rather than a single decisive rebuttal. The physical world of buildings offers its own corrective remedies. Preservation efforts that include public histories display plaques, provide guided tours, and publish research that connects architecture to documented builders and patrons. Walking a streetscape with an informed guide reorients perceptions. The dome that once looked unplaceable starts to fit into a documented timeline. These embodied experiences combine visual pleasure with documentary clarity, bridging the gap between immediate sensation and archival fact. At the same time, scholars should remain humble about what archives cannot recover. Some histories are irretrievably lost, and filling those gaps with silence is sometimes the only honest position. Admitting uncertainty does not equal weakness, it is a stronger stance than manufacturing certainty. Where evidence is absent, the ethical response is qualified speculation and an invitation for further research, not the confident assertion of an alternate global history. The story of Tartaria also opens a conversation about temporal narratives. The past is not a static museum but a palimpsest where traces overlap and overwrite. Treating time as layered helps explain why buildings look anachronistic. They are palimpsests, with renovations and repurposings that reflect many temporalities. Recognizing palimpsest thinking disposes us toward nuance rather than wholesale narratives of disappearance. We should also examine how archives themselves are constructed narratives shaped by those who fund them. Philanthropy, state priorities, and institutional missions determine what gets saved. Because of this, archives can reproduce existing power dynamics even as they preserve cultural memory. Critical archivists aim to counterbalance that bias by preserving marginalized voices and making gaps visible rather than hiding them. That visibility reduces the space for grand conspiracy claims because it shows a more textured past. A further point concerns the legal and bureaucratic paper trails that tie architecture to society. Property deeds, tax assessments, and legal disputes often survive longer than personal diaries or ephemeral catalogs. These documents can ground a building's history in transactions and names, connecting it to social realities rather than to anonymous grand narratives. Legal documents are dull in appearance, but they often provide the most reliable anchor when an image excites the imagination. In some cases, cross-disciplinary inquiry sheds light. Anthropologists, engineers, linguists, and historians working together can trace how style, material, and language intersect. An engineer can explain construction techniques, a linguist can parse inscriptions, and an anthropologist can contextualize space within cultural practices. The collaborative approach is labor-intensive but powerful because it attacks a problem from multiple angles at once. That multiplicity of perspectives is precisely what conspiracies lack. It is also worth noting how generational shifts affect reception. Younger audiences raised on the internet may be more skeptical of institutional authority or more comfortable with eclectic sources. Older generations might still place more trust in established academic voices. These generational differences lead to intergenerational conversations that can either bridge gaps or reinforce misunderstanding depending on how they are handled. Recognizing these differences helps in designing communication strategies that are more likely to be heard across age groups. The legal implications of asserting a hidden empire are sometimes perverse. Claims about repurposed buildings and stolen artifacts can lead to calls for restitution without clear legal grounds. That can bog down legitimate efforts for repatriation by muddying public discourse with overblown, unfounded demands. A rational legal framework depends on evidentiary standards and provenance, and sensational claims that ignore those standards ultimately weaken the causes of actual restitution movements. Another subtle dynamic is how private collections interact with public archives. Wealthy collectors often purchase artifacts and photographs that then disappear into private holdings. This privatization creates real gaps in public knowledge. When private collections are later made public or cataloged, they can rewrite historical narratives. The temptation to ascribe malevolent intent to private ownership is understandable, but it is often simply a function of money and access rather than organized suppression. The role of linguistic nuance can also be decisive. Words like Tartary, Tartaria, Tataria, and other variants appear interchangeably in older texts. Each carries different connotations and histories depending on the language and era. Without careful philological analysis, these terms can be conflated and misapplied. Specialists in historical linguistics can untangle such knots, which is why academic collaboration matters in clarifying ambiguous terms. The story also prompts reflection on how we judge credibility. Are highly produced videos more trustworthy than a dusty municipal ledger? How much does production value sway perception? The answer is that style often substitutes for substance in public judgments. A calm, low-budget explanation of architectural history can be harder to sell than a breathless, visually dynamic video. Awareness of this bias helps audiences resist being overwhelmed by aesthetics at the expense of evidence. Religion and spiritual narratives sometimes overlap with Tartaria claims. Some groups interpret a supposed hidden empire in eschatological or mystical terms, tying it to prophecy or ancient wisdom. Those interpretations transform the conversation into a different register where documentary argument may have little purchase. Respecting spiritual perspectives while maintaining analytic rigor is a delicate balance, and it often requires separate conversations that honor both perspectives without conflation. We should not lose sight of the pleasures that animate the phenomenon. There is real delight in uncovering old photographs, and visiting a grand but neglected hall, and tracing a puzzling map. That delight is a human good and should be cultivated. The challenge is to foster a delight that coexists with humility, skepticism, and a commitment to evidence. When pleasure and rigor coexist, curiosity becomes a path to knowledge rather than to myth. A further dimension is how storytelling shapes memory. Communities narrate their pasts to form identities, and sometimes the most resonant stories are those that confer dignity or explain suffering. Tartaria narratives sometimes provide a sense of lost grandeur for communities whose histories are fragmented. Engaging with those communities to co-produce histories that are both empirically grounded and emotionally resonant can heal rather than obscure. Collaborative history-making is one of the more hopeful outcomes of this entire episode. Practical steps to improve the situation are varied and local. Archives can host open days and public talks that demystify the process of research. Schools can integrate primary sources into curricula so students learn to read documents critically. Journalists can seek out archivists as sources rather than relying solely on visual tropes. Each small intervention nudges the public sphere toward greater discernment and reduces the space for sweeping but unsupported claims. Finally, the enduring lesson of the Tartaria story is epistemic humility. We live in an era where images and claims circulate faster than we can verify them. That speed tempts us to accept narratives that resonate emotionally. Slowing down, verifying provenance, consulting experts, and remaining open to correction are the practices that protect knowledge. They are not glamorous, but they are effective. The photograph that started it all does not lose its mystery simply because a ledger identifies the architect or a city permit dates the renovation. Mystery and evidence can coexist. A building can be both beautiful and well documented. The problem is not that we desire wonder, it is that we sometimes build wonder on weak foundations. Strengthening those foundations allows wonder to persist without distorting the past. The birth of the Tartaria conspiracy is therefore not a story about a single lie but about the confluence of human needs, archival gaps, technological incentives, and social distrust. Each factor plays a part, and none alone explains the phenomenon. Understanding that plurality helps us respond in proportion rather than with grand gestures that match the drama of the claim but miss its roots. As the narrative folds back on itself, the listener is invited to become part detective and part archivist, to ask for citations, to seek original sources, and to appreciate the labor that produces reliable histories. The call is not to police curiosity but to equip it with better tools. Equipped curiosity is the antidote to simplistic answers and the path to deeper understanding. And so the story circulates onward, through podcasts and comment threads, through late-night forums and excitable videos. Some will convert to skepticism, others will double down, and new participants will enter the conversation bringing fresh images and new claims. The important thing is not to win a rhetorical victory, but to foster a culture that prizes evidence and temperance alongside imagination and wonder. If you encounter the claim again on a feed or from a friend at a dinner table, you can ask simple, civil questions. Where did the image come from? What do property records show? Who cataloged that map and when? Those questions are not traps, but tools that help separate durable knowledge from compelling speculation. They invite a conversation rather than a confrontation and model a method that privileges evidence over flair. The narrative of suppression or misinterpretation is not easily resolved because it hinges on complex social and archival processes. Yet the balance of evidence favors misinterpretation when taken across the available records, even while acknowledging that archives have real limits and that suppression has occurred in particular instances. The distinction matters because it determines how we direct our efforts, toward better access and education or toward fruitless accusations of global cover-up. In the end, the story of Tartaria teaches us to love the past with clear eyes. We should savor the pleasure of grand buildings and puzzling maps while calling on the patient methods that historians and archivists use to trace origins and meanings. That blend of wonder and discipline makes for a richer relationship with history than either naive belief or cynical dismissal can provide. There are practical joys in following this method. You might discover an obscure photograph paired with a letter in a municipal archive that explains the commission. You could learn a phrase in another language that untangles a mistranslation. You might sit in a reading room and feel the weight of a document in hand, connecting tactile reality with intellectual clarity. These small discoveries add up, and they yield a more satisfying form of revelation than a conspiracy ever could. As long as there are photographs without captions, maps with fading ink, and buildings with complex histories, stories will arise to fill the gaps. The best response is not to demand that mystery be eliminated, but to make the process of resolving mysteries more accessible. Open archives, public scholarship, and patient storytelling are the most effective countermeasures. They do not extinguish wonder, they channel it toward truth. The conversation does not end here because history is, by nature, ongoing. New documents are discovered, new interpretations emerge, and old narratives are revised. Tartaria may recede as new evidence accumulates, or it may evolve into a different myth with new contours. Either way, the prudent listener carries away a few enduring habits: ask for provenance, seek multiple sources, and respect the slow work that transforms fragments into histories. If you find yourself swept up in a compelling claim, give yourself the gift of time. Let curiosity be patient. Read a footnote, visit a municipal office, ask an archivist a basic question, and see where the evidence leads. The journey from mystery to understanding is often longer than a viral video, but it is also more rewarding and more durable. We began with a photograph and a feeling, and we end with an invitation to keep looking better. Keep the wonder, cultivate the method. The past deserves both our awe and our care, and treating it with both allows us to tell truer, richer stories about the world we inherit and the ways we remember it. There is a hush that falls over the internet at night, a low, persistent murmur that threads through forums, image boards, and late-night video channels. It speaks of vanished empires and buried technologies, of grand cities erased from history as if by a global amnesia. At the center of this whisper sits a single name, Tartaria, a shadowy placeholder for everything the modern mind finds tantalizingly missing from official accounts of the past. If you have never encountered the idea of Tartaria before, the first impression is often visual. People show sepia photographs of ornate domes and classical facades with an almost reverent tone, and you can feel the awe in their voices as they point to recurring features and ask why no one mentions this incredible architecture. The images feel like proof because they are so vividly real, and that feeling is a powerful engine for belief, especially when wrapped in narrative that explains, rather than complicates, the gap in what you were taught. To understand why Tartaria persists, we have to start with a more mundane history of names and maps. For centuries, European cartographers used the word Tartary or Tartaria to denote vast, vague stretches of northern and central Asia, territories inhabited by peoples Europeans considered foreign and poorly known. The label was not a claim about a single political unity, but a cartographic shorthand for regions the mapmakers had not fully surveyed, and yet that shorthand became, for some modern readers, a seed for more sweeping stories. Language itself plays a role in the endurance of the idea. Words like Tartary carry the weight of antique authority. They come from travel narratives, from explorers' journals, from the pages of encyclopedias that predate modern nationalism. When these sources are rediscovered in fragments, or when old maps are scanned and shared online without context, the historical fuzziness becomes an invitation. People see an old word and feel a mystery, because the older the language, the grander the possibilities it seems to imply. The aesthetic factor should not be underestimated. The architecture that conspiracy-minded communities latch onto is undeniably striking: ornate ironwork, enormous domes, intricate facades, and massive staircases. When photographs of these structures are isolated and presented as evidence, the mind grasps for a narrative that matches the visual drama. The buildings seem to imply a level of global coordination, a lost technology, or a suppressed history, and that implication is more compelling to many than the patient work of archival research. Visual storytelling thrives online, and the internet is particularly hospitable to motifs that feel cinematic. Video essays string together historical photographs, dramatic music, and a narrator with an authoritative tone. The editing compresses centuries of complexity into a few minutes, and what remains is a simplified, emotionally resonant story, an advanced civilization, deliberately erased. That economy of storytelling favors certainty over nuance, and emotional resonance over evidentiary caution. Another reason Tartaria endures is that it answers a particular kind of uncertainty with a single, satisfying explanation. When people sense that the past is more complicated than they've been taught, the mind seeks a story that restores order. A mystery with a single hidden cause is preferable to 1,000 tangled historical processes. Tartaria, as a concept, acts like a master key. It unlocks various anomalies, explains away architectural oddities, and unifies scattered doubts into one coherent narrative. The social dynamics of online communities amplify these tendencies. Forums and social media groups operate like echo chambers, where repeated claims acquire the force of fact through repetition. Members who share images or theories receive immediate feedback and affirmation, which reinforces belief. Over time, the community builds its own lore, specialized vocabulary, and interpretive habits that make it difficult for outside corrections to take hold. There is also a performative aspect to embracing Tartaria. For some, it is an act of identity formation, a way to belong to a group that sees itself as awake to a hidden truth. Being part of that collective knowing confers social status and creates a sense of superiority over those who accept mainstream history. This dynamic is not unique to Tartaria. It underlies many fringe beliefs, but it is particularly potent when a narrative positions its adherents as guardians of a suppressed past. Beyond psychology and aesthetics, there are concrete historical roots that facts can be traced to, and understanding these roots helps explain the myth's staying power. The real historical Tartary was less a unified empire and more a catch-all term used by outsiders to describe a vast and diverse region. It covered Mongol steppe domains, Turkic khanates, and diverse societies along the Silk Road. Those real histories are complicated and often glossed over in basic education, leaving fertile ground for reimagining. Cartography itself is a teacher of humility about how we know the past. Old maps were imperfect. They mixed hearsay, travelers' tales, and fragments of stolen knowledge with careful survey. When modern readers encounter these imperfect artifacts without a guiding explanation, imagination fills the gaps. The clouds, sea monsters, and blank spaces on antique maps invite projection, and Tartaria is a modern projection that transforms cartographic ambiguity into a full-blown alternate chronicle. The mud flood theory is one of the most pervasive narratives within the Tartaria scene, an image-rich story that ties together ruined facades, partially buried windows, and layered city streets. Proponents claim that a global cataclysm submerged entire cities in a rapid deluge of sediment, explaining why many historical buildings appear to have a lower story buried below street level. The scenario is visually convincing until you examine local histories, geological evidence, and the realities of urban development, which often reveal incremental processes like street regrading, floodplain changes, and construction practices. The appeal of cataclysmic explanations rests in part on narrative simplicity. A single event is easier to grasp than cumulative social and environmental processes that stretch over decades and centuries. Catastrophes are cinematic and emotionally gripping, offering heroes, villains, and visible scars in the landscape. When people want to believe they are witnessing the traces of a suppressed global event, the need for drama can outweigh the slower, less dramatic truths of urban evolution and municipal engineering. The modern spread of the Tartaria idea is inseparable from the visual archives that have recently become widely accessible. Libraries, national archives, and private collections have digitized millions of photographs and made them searchable with a few keystrokes. This democratization of imagery allows enthusiasts to assemble galleries of buildings from across continents and treat them as if they were the remnants of a single civilization. The technology that empowers academic research also empowers speculative narrative. The photograph is a seductive kind of evidence because it channels the immediacy of seeing into the spaces between explanation. Images lack context when detached from captions, dates, and provenance. Without that metadata, a photograph can be reframed to fit any story. It is a form of optical ambiguity. What you see is real, but what it means is up for grabs, and that looseness invites reinterpretation. Conspiracy thrives in information vacuums, and gaps in accessible, well-explained history create just such a vacuum. Many people simply do not have the time or training to navigate archives, read primary sources, or consult specialists. The internet fills this need with ready-made narratives that claim to synthesize complex evidence into plain truths. That convenience is powerful, and it is a major reason why Tartaria-style stories resonate with wide audiences. The economics of attention on digital platforms reward content that triggers strong engagement. Outrage and awe are currency in an attention economy, and narratives about suppressed empires perform well. Creators who build channels around Tartaria receive views, subscriptions, and sometimes patronage. These incentives encourage more content of the same flavor, amplifying the narrative and normalizing its claims among viewers who trust platform metrics as a sign of legitimacy. There is a fascinating interplay between nostalgia and conspiracy in the Tartaria zeitgeist. The ornate buildings that become evidence of a lost civilization evoke a sense of grandeur and order many feel is missing from the modern world. In times of uncertainty, it's comforting to imagine a past with sweeping civic architecture and grand public spaces. That yearning for an ordered past can morph into a suspicion that the modern state or elite intentionally erased such a past, which adds a political edge to what began as aesthetic longing. Political currents can co-opt the past in service of present agendas. The idea of a forgotten empire can be attractive to nationalists, revisionists, or groups seeking to discredit existing institutions by alleging hidden alternatives. Tartaria narratives sometimes intersect with broader streams of anti-establishment sentiment, weaving together grievances about inequality and corruption with claims of historical suppression. That fusion makes the myth versatile. It can be appropriated by different movements to bolster diverse claims. The role of charismatic communicators cannot be overlooked. A convincing narrator can transform ambiguous evidence into compelling myth. Voice, cadence, and rhetorical certainty do the heavy lifting. When a storyteller speaks with confidence about lost technologies and global cover-ups, listeners are inclined to follow. This dynamic points to an essential truth about persuasion. The feel of certainty often outweighs the content of the argument, especially in audiovisual media. There is also a tendency to romanticize ignorance. Inverting the conventional flow of expertise feels rebellious. People enjoy the status of being among the first to notice something hidden, to have cracked a secret code. Tartaria offers that thrill. It promises that beneath the surface of common knowledge lies a dramatic truth that only a determined few will discover. That sense of discovery is intoxicating and keeps people engaged even when counter-evidence is presented. Psychologists point to pattern seeking as a human universal. We evolved to see relationships in scattered data because, for survival, false positives were less costly than missed signals. In modern informational environments, that trait can misfire. Architectural similarities across different regions and eras, classical columns, domes, and ornamentation, are often the result of cultural exchange and diffusion, not a single hidden source. But pattern seeking makes a unified origin story appealing. Material culture and technological diffusion are complicated processes, and the ornate styles attributed to Tartaria have well-documented histories. Neoclassical architecture, for instance, drew on Greco-Roman models filtered through the Enlightenment and then spread globally through colonial networks, trade, and emulation. Industrialization introduced prefabricated ornamentation that could be shipped and installed far from its manufacturing origin. Once you account for trade, colonialism, and industrial manufacturing, the architectural similarities start to make practical sense. Yet explanations that ground anomalies in trade and stylistic diffusion are often unsatisfying to those who hunger for a more dramatic narrative. The mundane explanations lack romance and are less shareable as spectacle. They require readers to accept slow processes of social change rather than a single hero or villain, and that measured acceptance rarely circulates as enthusiastically as a single, definitive revelation. Another factor is the role of archival illusions. Documents and images often come without their history when presented on social media, and users assume that whatever is interesting must be hidden deliberately. The very act of digitizing and highlighting certain items creates the impression that they were previously suppressed. In reality, digitization can remove material from its archival context and inadvertently create the impression of conspiracy. The Internet also encourages bricolage, the assembling of disparate artifacts into a single narrative mosaic. A photograph from 1890, a map from 1750, and a showing of a ruined palace become pieces in a puzzle, and the puzzle builder's task is to fit them into a coherent picture. That assemblage tendency privileges narrative cohesion over historical fidelity, and once a compelling mosaic is assembled, It becomes resistant to correction because every new related piece reinforces the pattern. Sometimes the persistence of a myth like Tartaria reveals more about present anxieties than about the past. Economic insecurity, rapid technological change, and political polarization make people uncomfortable with existing institutions. A story about a lost global civilization resonates because it reframes present anxieties into a narrative of deliberate loss. It is psychologically easier to imagine a conspiracy than to confront systemic and diffuse problems that lack clear culprits. Cultural memory plays a role as well. Societies remember selectively, and official histories often emphasize triumphs or national narratives that serve current identities. When portions of the past do not fit a national story, they can be glossed over, minimized, or forgotten. Fringe narratives exploit these lacunae, highlighting the absence itself as evidence of intentional suppression, which is a persuasive rhetorical move but a slippery one in terms of evidence. To grapple with this phenomenon, it helps to consider how real professional historians work. They build arguments through painstaking engagement with primary sources, cross-referencing accounts, and situating artifacts within broader technological, economic, and cultural frameworks. That labor-intensive work is often invisible in public conversations, which favor quick syntheses and sensational claims. The contrast between professional nuance and online brevity fuels the appeal of simpler alternatives. Misinformation researchers have noted how corrections often fail to dislodge beliefs once they take root. Facts are not neutral, they arrive wrapped in narratives and emotions. A correction that only supplies data without addressing the underlying story and the feelings tied to it will likely have limited impact. Engaging with belief in Tartaria thus requires more than refutation. It requires empathetic storytelling that accounts for why people find the myth meaningful. There are moments when curiosity about the myth yields fruitful scholarly engagement. Museum curators, archivists, and historians sometimes encounter interested laypeople and realize they have an opportunity to translate expertise into accessible narratives. Exhibitions that contextualize ornate architecture, explain building techniques, and show trade routes can demystify without diminishing wonder. The key is to honor the aesthetic appreciation while supplying the missing connective tissue of history. Public history initiatives have the potential to bridge the gap between fascination and understanding. City tours, interactive archives, and community history projects can make the slow processes of urban change visible. When people see how a street was elevated over decades, or how building facades were reused and repurposed, the apparently miraculous transforms into the comprehensible. That transformation does not strip away beauty, it deepens it by revealing human ingenuity across time. Digital humanities projects also offer a path forward. By aggregating metadata, providing provenance, and linking disparate images to primary documents, platforms can reduce the interpretive vacuum that allows conspiratorial narratives to flourish. Good digital tools prioritize context as a core feature, and when imagery is presented alongside archival records, creation dates, and maker information, casual viewers are less likely to leap to extraordinary conclusions. There is an ethical dimension to consider when engaging with communities that embrace Tartaria. Mockery rarely persuades, it often pushes believers deeper into their communities. Respectful engagement that asks questions, invites exploration of archives, and offers alternative narratives in a non-judgmental way stands a better chance of opening space for reflection. The aim is not to win debates but to reconnect curiosity with credible inquiry. At the same time, we must be clear-eyed about how some elements of the Tartaria scene link with more harmful currents. Certain strands intersect with revisionist ideologies, racialized narratives, and anti-democratic movements. Those intersections are not inevitable, but they exist, and they complicate any neutral stance toward the myth. Addressing these connections requires vigilance and a willingness to challenge hateful or manipulative uses of history. The phenomenon also raises questions about epistemic authority in the digital age. Who gets to interpret the past, and on what grounds? For centuries, historians and archivists claimed expertise by virtue of training and access to sources. The Internet dissolved some of those barriers, democratizing access but also democratizing authority in a way that can produce both creative reinterpretations and dangerous distortions. Navigating this new landscape requires new norms about transparency, source citation, and critical engagement. One productive direction is to cultivate digital literacy that emphasizes source provenance and evidentiary standards. Teaching people how to read captions, track down original publications, and verify dates can inoculate against hasty conclusions. This kind of literacy is not merely about debunking, it is about empowering curiosity so that it leads to rigorous inquiry rather than to closed narratives that reinforce pre-existing beliefs. Another useful approach is to foreground the contingency of historical knowledge. History is not a fixed ledger of facts waiting to be discovered. It is a discipline that interprets evidence within frameworks that change as new questions emerge. When we present history as an interpretive project rather than as a list of immutable truths, we prepare people to accept complexity rather than substituting simpler but false narratives. There is also value in acknowledging the emotional texture of the past. People are drawn to Tartaria because the story produces emotion, wonder, indignation, nostalgia, and often, historians have been trained to be dispassionate in ways that alienate non-specialists. Reintroducing emotion into historical storytelling, without sacrificing evidence, can make complex explanations more resonant and less easily displaced by sensational claims. Art and literature can mediate between the mythic allure of Tartaria and rigorous scholarship. Creative works that imagine lost cities while also referencing documented histories can satisfy the appetite for narrative without abandoning facts. Fictionalizing aspects of the past need not be dishonest when presented transparently as imagination built atop research, and such work can be a bridge for those attracted primarily to story and aesthetics. It is worth remembering that the impulse behind Tartaria is not entirely negative. At its core is a hunger for wonder, for the sense that the past holds marvels we have overlooked. That hunger can be a powerful motivator for learning and engagement. If channeled through accessible and rigorous resources, it could encourage people to explore archives, visit museums, and engage with public historians rather than retreat into conspiratorial communities. Practical steps to channel curiosity include building community-oriented historical projects that invite public participation. Oral history projects, participatory mapping, and local archival days invite people into the process of making history rather than simply consuming prepackaged narratives. Participation promotes ownership and demystifies process, showing that historians are not gatekeepers of truth but practitioners who wrestle with evidence in view of the public. Academic institutions and cultural organizations can respond by making their work more visible and interactive. Short video explainers that contextualize popular images, companion podcasts that walk listeners through primary sources, and open-access exhibitions can reduce the opacity that breeds speculation. When institutional voices speak clearly, frequently, and without condescension, they can regain some measure of authority in public discourse. Legal and policy responses are more complicated. Content moderation on platforms sometimes tries to curb harmful misinformation, but moderation alone cannot eliminate the root causes of belief. Educational policy that strengthens critical thinking and media literacy in schools offers a long-term remedy, but it is slow and requires sustained investment. In the meantime, community-level interventions focused on dialogue and participation are often the most productive. The persistence of Tartaria also invites humility from experts. When historians dismiss fringe beliefs out of hand, they miss a chance to understand the concerns driving them. Listening to why people find the idea compelling can reveal gaps in public history provision that institutions can address. Humility does not mean accepting falsehoods, but it does mean approaching communities with curiosity and a willingness to translate expertise into accessible forms. Narratives about suppressed histories have a long pedigree, and the human appetite for lost civilizations is not new. The 19th century was filled with tales of Atlantis, hidden Khmer cities, and grand mythic pasts that fed romance literature and pseudo-scholarship alike. The modern internet only accelerates and amplifies that perennial pattern, connecting isolated enthusiasts into global communities and giving old myths new life. As long as large parts of the past remain opaque to ordinary curiosity, alternative histories will flourish. But opacity is not destiny. Transparent archives, responsive museums, and accessible scholarship can narrow the space in which myths take root. Building those institutions is a long-term project that requires resources, patience, and a commitment to public engagement, but it is a practical antidote to the appeal of conspiratorial narratives. It is also important to separate ridicule from refutation. Debunking for its own sake often hardens belief, while clear, well-reasoned rebuttals paired with accessible evidence can invite reconsideration. Documentaries and essays that remix the same compelling imagery into narratives grounded in context can undercut the mythic appeal without dismissing the beauty that inspired it. Beauty need not be a portal to falsehood, it can be a gateway to genuine historical curiosity. Consider the role of local historians and community archives in this endeavor. They often possess the microhistorical knowledge that explains apparent anomalies, street-level changes, building permits, and the often undocumented labor of repair and reuse. Connecting public audiences to these local stewards of memory can demystify the extraordinary and restore a sense of agency over the past. Knowing who to ask is half the battle in turning mystery into understanding. There is an irony in how the internet both democratizes access to historical materials and decontextualizes them. The same platforms that allow anyone to see a rare photograph also allow anyone to frame it as evidence of a suppressed empire. The solution is not to withdraw from digital spaces, but to populate them with more and better context. When archival institutions and educators flood the same channels with contextualized content, they create competing narratives that can reclaim attention. In practical listening terms, when you encounter a dramatic claim about Tartaria or any hidden history, pause and ask a few grounded questions. Where does the image or document come from? Is there a reliable caption or catalog entry? What do local histories and architectural studies say? These questions are not meant to quench wonder but to guide it. Curiosity and rigor are not opposites but partners in discovery. Some of the most productive dialogues happen when believers and skeptics engage with humility and a shared love of history. When both sides recognize the other's values, beauty, truth, belonging, the conversation shifts from combat to inquiry. Shared investigative projects, where participants examine primary sources together under the guidance of archivists, can create transformative moments of mutual learning. If there is a single thread that explains why Tartaria endures, it is this: the story meets deep human needs. It supplies wonder, identity, and a coherent answer to complexity, all wrapped in the satisfying package of a grand narrative. That combination is potent, and it will not be undone by facts alone. Rather, it requires building alternative narratives that are equally compelling, emotionally resonant, and grounded in evidence. The endurance of Tartaria also serves as a mirror reflecting weaknesses in our public knowledge systems. Where museums, archives, and schools fail to make the past accessible, myths rush in to fill the void. The project, then, is not simply to debunk but to build. Creating spaces where people can be both moved by beauty and guided by evidence offers a durable counterweight to conspiracy. Change will be incremental. It will require patient work by educators, archivists, content creators, and community leaders. It will require investment in public-facing scholarship and digital infrastructure that values context, and in educational initiatives that teach how to read the past critically. There is no quick fix, but there is a path forward rooted in accessibility and humility. At the same time, we should not romanticize the past as a repository of unalloyed wisdom. The real histories behind Tartaria include conquest, displacement, and brutal imperial logics. A responsible engagement with the past acknowledges both beauty and pain, recognizing that the grandeur seen in architecture often rests on complicated social and political foundations. That fuller story is harder to tell but ultimately more honest. To listen well to the echoes of Tartaria is to hear not only the myth but the anxieties and desires that give it life. Those echoes point to a hunger for meaning, for connection, and for a past that feels comprehensible. Meeting that hunger with patience, context, and creative storytelling can transform fascination into learning and myth into informed memory. There will always be room in human imagination for lost civilizations and marvelous secrets, and there is no obligation to stamp out every speculative story. Myths and fiction can coexist with rigorous history if their boundaries are respected. The healthier public conversation makes those boundaries clear without dimming the enchantment that draws people to the past. Ultimately, the endurance of Tartaria is less about secret empires and more about how we, as a society, construct knowledge and community in the digital age. It is a symptom of both the power and the peril of democratized information. The task ahead is not to silence curiosity but to shepherd it, to make the archive speak plainly, and to ensure that wonder leads toward truth rather than away from it. We all help shape what's true and what's myth. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you see yourself more as someone who questions everything or as someone who tries to bring clarity to the chaos.